y el manejo de las fronteras de Estados Unidos desde que asumió su cargo en febrero de 2021. Ojalá no tuviéramos que estar aquí y que este proceso no fuera necesario. Ojalá nuestra frontera suroeste fuera segura. Ojalá nuestro gobierno hiciera que se cumplieran las leyes aprobadas por el Congreso e hiciera su trabajo para velar por la seguridad de los estadounidenses. Lamentablemente, el secretario Mayorkas no ha hecho ninguna de estas cosas. Durante casi un año, la Comisión está realizando una vasta investigación sobre las causas, costos y consecuencias de la crisis en nuestra frontera suroeste. La evidencia deja en claro que el secretario Mayorkas es el arquitecto de la devastación de la que hemos sido testigos por casi 3 años. Las determinaciones de esta investigación, disponibles para el público en el portal de la Cámara, junto con la posición del gobierno de no cambiar de curso, no nos deja una alternativa razonable que la posibilidad de un juicio político. Las acciones del secretario nos traen hoy aquí. Desde comienzos de 2021 hemos visto, incrédulos, como un número sin precedentes de extranjeros inadmisibles han cruzado por nuestra frontera, por puertos de entrada y atravesando las miles de millas de la frontera. La patrulla de fronteras ha registrado más de 8 millones de encuentros, 6,7 millones en la frontera sur. Para comparar, la patrulla de fronteras registró 3 millones de encuentros en todo el país de 2017 a 2020. Jay Johnson, ex secretario de Seguridad Nacional del presidente Obama, dijo en una ocasión que 1,000 encuentros al día agobiarían el sistema. Fin de la cita. Bajo la gestión del secretario Mayorkas, el promedio nunca ha sido de menos de 3,000 al día, llegando a hasta 10 o 12,000 por día. Las cifras internas dadas a conocer a los medios indican que ha habido 320,000 encuentros en diciembre solamente. Es un récord suficiente para llenar el Rose Bowl 3 veces en solo un mes. Aparte de estas cifras catastróficas y del enorme número de personas que han quedado libres en el país bajo la gestión del secretario Mayorkas, hay individuos que están cruzando la frontera y no son detenidos porque los cárteles agobian a las agencias con un gran número de coyotes que están escoltando a los migrantes. Los agentes los ven y los cuentan, pero no los pueden aprehender. Pero las cifras ciertamente son peores. Cuando los agentes son enviados a los centros de cruce para procesar a migrantes y la frontera queda desatendida, no hay agentes presentes para contar a los que se escapan. Este número de desconocidos es realmente enorme. Hay un número sin precedentes de inmigrantes ilegales que entran al país y los envían en autobús o por avión a la ciudad de su elección. Quiero que vean este video.
A border shutdown in El Paso, Texas, as hundreds force their way onto the Paso del Norte International Bridge. Title 42 has officially expired. Homeland Security officials say illegal border crossings topped 10,000 per day this week, the highest levels ever.
Thousands of migrants in central Mexico continue to travel on freight trains and travel all the way to the southern border, arriving here in Eagle Pass.
Outnumbered and out-resourced, Border Patrol agents say they are struggling to keep up with this massive influx of migrants descending on our southern border.
Border Patrol clearly does not have the manpower to process the thousands of migrants here. The situation is pretty dire.
Hundreds upon hundreds of adult men who have crossed illegally, waiting here in the Arizona sun for Border Patrol to apprehend them, and they hope to be released into the United States somewhere.
Sources telling News Nation that agents have been pulled from nearby checkpoints to assist in processing the thousands of migrants crossing into Eagle Pass every day.
This is all by design. The smugglers realize that this particular area is vulnerable.
Lo que los estadounidenses comprenden es que estas cifras históricas y el caos que vieron en las pantallas, esto es resultado de un problema más profundo, y ese problema no es inestabilidad en otros países, pobreza o cambio climático. ni tampoco un sistema inmigratorio disfuncional. Todos estos problemas vienen de antes que el secretario Mayorkas iniciara su gestión, pero nunca habíamos tenido una crisis como esta. El mismo New York Times admite que estos factores no explican el repunte. No ha habido guerras recientes en América Latina y la tasa de pobreza se ha mantenido estable. Fin de la cita. También 2 de las 16 ciudades del mundo con más alto índice de homicidios son en Estados Unidos. Esto se le informó al secretario Mayorkas en testimonio del secretario de Justicia Merrick Garland, quien dijo que esta situación está siendo explotada por los cárteles, pero el secretario Mayorkas adopta otras políticas para ampliar las políticas de detención y liberación, empoderando a los cárteles y matando a estadounidenses. Después de casi 3 años de ver esta situación, ¿qué otra conclusión se puede derivar? Que esta es una crisis intencional. El secretario Mayorkas se ha negado a hacer que se cumplan las leyes emitidas por el Congreso, haciendo el país menos seguro. Lo que vemos aquí es una violación voluntaria del juramento del secretario Mayorkas, una violación voluntaria. El secretario Mayorkas ha utilizado sus políticas para poner en libertad a millones de migrantes inadmisibles en el país, a pesar de lo que establece la ley, que esta medida solo puede usarse en caso por caso y en una base provisional para atender necesidades humanitarias urgentes. El jefe de la patrulla en Laredo nos decía que le habían dicho que esto era solo para casos humanitarios extremos. Si había un niño enfermo, tenía que ir al hospital, se le daba un permiso a los padres o cosas parecidas. Pero eso era algo muy raro, no ocurría todos los días. Fin de la cita. Este jefe tiene la razón. La escala en la que el secretario Mayorkas ha utilizado esta política es algo sin precedentes e inconsistente con leyes aprobadas por el Congreso, y así lo han dicho múltiples jueces federales, pero sigue siendo un componente central de la agenda del secretario. La ley de inmigración y nacionalidad también requiere que los inmigrantes ilegales detenidos cruzando la frontera sean detenidos para iniciar el proceso de deportación. El secretario Mayorkas ha ignorado esta ley. En el año 2013, de acuerdo con cifras del departamento, el gobierno de Obama detuvo al 82% de los inmigrantes ilegales desde el momento en que los encontraban hasta que el caso se decidía, y otro 9% permanecía recluido por un cierto periodo después de eso. Es un buen récord bajo un gobierno demócrata. El secretario Mayorkas, en su primer año de gestión, ese número pasó de 82% a 10%. Los inmigrantes ilegales no detenidos pasaron a 62%. En opinión de la Corte, el juez federal Ken Wetherell escribió, y cito, la evidencia establece que a fines de enero o febrero de 2021, el Departamento de Seguridad Nacional hizo un cambio discreto en su política de liberación bajo condiciones apremiantes a liberación a menos que haya una razón apremiante para no hacerlo. Se le dijo a la comisión que las personas, al pensar que van a ser liberados sin consecuencias, es algo que muchos migrantes le dicen a los agentes. Bajo la gestión del secretario Mayorkas, esto es casi seguro. Individuos culpables de crímenes violentos y algunos en la lista de terrorismo han sido puestos en libertad en el país. Solo el lunes, múltiples fuentes confirmaron que el secretario Mayorkas admitió que la tasa de liberación de inmigrantes ilegales estaba bordeando el 85%. En total, estas cifras indican que más de 3 millones de extranjeros inadmisibles han sido liberados en el país bajo la gestión del secretario Mayorkas. Considerando el 1.800.000 que se han escapado, los que no se conocen, estamos hablando casi de la población del estado de Carolina del Sur. No solo el secretario Mayorkas se ha negado a detener a estos individuos, como dispone la ley, sino que también ha hecho casi imposible que los funcionarios de inmigración los deporten. Sus políticas mayormente han restringido la capacidad del Servicio de Inmigración de detener a estos individuos e iniciar deportaciones. La cifra ha bajado considerablemente a menos de 16.000 Las cifras más recientes son mejores, pero todavía están por debajo de las cifras más bajas del gobierno anterior, en medio de la pandemia del COVID. Los criminales detenidos, que eran 90%, pasaron a solo 43%. El mismo secretario no está acatando sus estándares de darle prioridad a la seguridad pública. El ex jefe de sector en San Diego nos dijo en mayo de 2023 que él no pensaba que las consecuencias de ser deportado fueran utilizadas para disuadir la inmigración ilegal. Y hasta los demócratas de Texas, el señor Cuellar, han dicho, si no se detiene a la gente, si no se envía a la gente de vuelta, la frontera se convierte simplemente en una escala. El secretario Mayorkas comenzó a desmantelar políticas efectivas que habían asegurado la frontera suroeste, a pesar de ser advertido por personal experimentado de las consecuencias resultantes. Eso, aparejado con su decisión de mantener sus políticas ilegales, indican que esto es algo intencional. Y debo enfatizar que estos no son simplemente diferencias de políticas. Estamos hablando de un patrón de años de negarse a hacer cumplir las leyes emitidas por el Congreso. Nuestra investigación también ha determinado que el secretario Mayorkas violó la autoridad de su cargo. El secretario Mayorkas le ha dado órdenes al departamento de crear programas ilegales de libertad bajo palabra, permitiendo que un número sin precedentes de individuos entren al país, individuos que de otra manera no tendrían base legal para estar aquí, y para darle un incentivo a los migrantes para que hagan este peligroso viaje hasta nuestra frontera sur. Él también le ha dicho efectivamente a los funcionarios del Servicio de Inmigración que no hagan su trabajo haciendo que se cumplan las leyes de inmigración. De acuerdo con sus propios lineamientos, el hecho que un individuo sea deportable no debe ser, per se, la base de una acción en su contra. Fin de la cita. Nuestro personal no tiene por qué basarse en el hecho de una condena para un delito deportable, sino que deben sopesar los factores atenuantes a favor de declinar las acciones de deportación. Él también ha supervisado el uso irresponsable de personal federal para ocultar este desastre. Los funcionarios en la frontera han sido enviados a la frontera suroeste para poner en libertad a estos migrantes. Cientos de profesionales de la unidad de investigación han sido retirados de investigaciones serias como crímenes sexuales, explotación de menores y otras atrocidades para hacer funciones administrativas en la frontera. Un denunciante dijo que su equipo le dijeron que cerrara sus investigaciones y los enviaron a la frontera a preparar sándwiches. El secretario ha abusado de su autoridad poniendo en riesgo a los estadounidenses. El secretario mayor le ha mentido repetidamente al pueblo estadounidense y al Congreso. Nuestra investigación ha puesto de manifiesto más de 100 instancias donde el secretario Mayorkas engañó al público. Especialmente dijo en abril de 2022 en una audiencia que tenía control operativo de la frontera suroeste. Según lo definen los estatutos federales, esto es falso. También dijo otra mentira diciendo en otras audiencias que él no había utilizado la definición estatutaria de control operacional, a pesar de que dijo que lo había hecho en la audiencia previa. Observen. ¿Diría usted bajo juramento que tenemos control operacional, sí o no? Sí. ¿Tenemos control operativo de la frontera? Sí, sí lo tenemos. Tal como lo define la ley. Evitar el ingreso ilegal de personas no autorizadas a hacer instrumentos terroristas, instrumentos de terrorismo, narcóticos y contrabando. Sigue usted diciendo que tenemos control operacional bajo esta definición. Congresista, creo que habríamos dicho lo mismo en 2020 y en 2018. Esa es la definición. No, no tenemos control operacional. Con respecto a la definición de control operacional, yo no utilizo la definición que aparece en la ley de defensa. ¿Admite usted que sus políticas han puesto al país más lejos del control operacional como lo define el Congreso? No. ¿Recuerda cuando usted me dijo claramente en su testimonio, tenemos control operacional? Cuando se le presentó la definición de control operacional, usted no vaciló y dijo, sí, Y de hecho, dijo, yo creo que mis predecesores habrían dicho lo mismo. Usted me miró a la cara, usted miró a todos los miembros de la comisión y dijo, tenemos control operacional. ¿Por qué? Congresista, 2 puntos. Primero, usted no me permitió completar mi respuesta. Pasemos al segundo punto. 2. La ley de defensa define el control operacional como que ni un solo individuo cruce la frontera. Yo se lo leí y usted lo leyó. Y usted mismo dijo que sí había control. Usted no dijo voy a explicar. Usted dijo sí, sí, varias veces. El secretario Mayorkas le dijo a esta comisión en septiembre de 2021, la frontera no es menos segura ahora que antes. La patrulla de fronteras ha registrado más de 290.000 encuentros en la frontera ese mes, comparado con 58.000 el septiembre previo. Claramente la frontera no es segura. ¿Por qué le mintió al Congreso? Otro video. ¿Está la frontera más segura bajo su liderazgo? Congresista, la frontera es segura, estamos ejecutando nuestro plan y he sido muy claro e inequívoco en ese sentido. Secretario, la pregunta es, ¿está la frontera más segura bajo su liderazgo? Congresista, no está menos segura que antes. Tenemos un número sin precedentes de narcóticos entrando por la frontera y usted sigue diciendo, sí o no, que la frontera es segura. Sí. Incluso en el podio de la Casa Blanca acusó falsamente a agentes de la patrulla de fronteras en el sector del río de darle latigazos a inmigrantes ilegales. Ese mismo día un correo electrónico indica que un testigo le dijo que no había habido latigazos a nadie. Sin embargo, él promovió esta narrativa a los más altos niveles. Un jefe de sector nos dijo, nunca le dimos latigazos a nadie. Esto no está autorizado y esto afecta a nuestros agentes. Fin de la cita. Veamos el video. Lo que hemos visto nos preocupa sobremanera. No se puede utilizar un caballo como arma para atacar de manera agresiva a un niño. Sabemos que estas imágenes recuerdan los peores momentos de las batallas de nuestro país contra el racismo sistémico. Primero que nada, estas imágenes nos horrorizan en cuanto a lo que sugieren y en lo que evocan, no solo en cuanto a la historia de nuestra nación, sino por el hecho de que esa página de la historia no se ha cerrado por completo. Así que hay más trabajo por hacer y estamos muy concentrados en hacerlo. Un correo electrónico revela que el secretario Alejandro Mayorkas fue informado por funcionarios que el cuento de los latigazos no era cierto. Pero en una conferencia de prensa horas más tarde, Mayorkas no disputó esa versión. Esto es solo una muestra de la mala conducta del secretario Mayorkas, pero voy a concluir recordándoles a todos que estamos aquí hoy, no solo porque los republicanos quieren que el secretario Mayorkas responda por sus acciones, sino porque más de 200 demócratas en la Cámara votaron para aprobar los artículos de juicio político a nuestra comisión. Estamos actuando de manera bipartidista, me imagino, para enfrentar a esos artículos. Y quiero dejarle en claro al pueblo estadounidense que la negativa del secretario Mayorkas a que se cumpla la ley es suficiente para un juicio político. La Constitución es totalmente clara en este sentido. El proceso se determinó no solo para destituir a funcionarios con actitudes criminales, sino a aquellos tan incompetentes que su conducta pone en peligro a sus compatriotas, traiciona la confianza del público y representan un abandono de la responsabilidad. Hay un entendido claro e indisputable que estos cargos no se limitan a crímenes procesables. Los fundadores del país entendieron que este poder de juicio político se refiere a todos los aspectos de mala conducta durante el ejercicio público, afectando al país, al orden constitucional o a la gente del país. Las acciones políticas y declaraciones del secretario Mayorkas ciertamente cubren estos estándares. Fin de la cita. En las próximas horas van a escuchar acerca de procesos y procedimientos y después de una minuciosa investigación, esta comisión ha seguido los procedimientos como lo contempló la Cámara en noviembre pasado y lo aprobó. Cualquier ataque a la integridad del proceso solo buscan distraer de las consecuencias de nuestras fronteras abiertas. Por nuestra frontera sur están ingresando niveles sin precedentes de fentanilo, matando a decenas de miles de estadounidenses cada año. Más de 300 individuos fueron detenidos ilegalmente cruzando la frontera sur en el año 2021, comparando con 14 en el año previo. Familias devastadas por criminales que han cometido asesinatos, violaciones y asaltos, por no decir de los otros delitos cometidos. El personal está perdiendo fe en su misión. Ellos y sus familias tienen que enfrentar esta situación en la frontera. El costo humano de esta crisis es real. El costo monetario de esta crisis ha sido astronómico. Solamente la ciudad de Nueva York proyecta que tendrá que gastar 12.000 millones de dólares para lidiar con el ingreso de migrantes ilegales al país para 2025. Y han tenido que recortar la fuerza policial para poder cubrir el costo. Han tenido que pagar por los entierros y cremaciones de inmigrantes ilegales en algunas jurisdicciones. Y esto va a aumentar. Como dijimos al comienzo de esta investigación, vamos a seguir los hechos. Es lo que hemos hecho y eso nos trae hasta este punto. Estoy ansioso por escuchar los testimonios de estos distinguidos fiscales que han visto esta crisis desarrollarse en sus estados. Por el bien de nuestra seguridad nacional y el bienestar del pueblo de los Estados Unidos, el secretario Mayorkas debe responder. Reconoce ahora el líder de la minoría, el caballero de Mississippi, el señor Thompson, para su declaración inicial. Gracias, señor presidente. Señor presidente, en abril, antes que esta comisión comenzara su llamada investigación de juicio político, el presidente Green le prometió a donantes en un acto de campaña que presentaría este caso contra el secretario Alejandro Mayorkas. De acuerdo con una grabación de sus comentarios obtenida por los medios, el presidente dijo a sus contribuyentes, vayan preparando las palomitas de maíz porque va a ser divertido. Quizá el presidente pensaba que solamente los presentes escucharían sus comentarios, pero la verdad tiene una cierta forma de salir a la luz. Él le prometió a un grupo de donantes todo lo que necesitaban escuchar acerca de por qué los republicanos están empeñados en hacerle un juicio al secretario Mayorkas. La promesa se hizo en un evento de campaña y poco después los republicanos comenzaron con su investigación al secretario Mayorkas. Ahora estamos en campaña y los republicanos lanzaron su proceso contra el secretario como parte de una treta política preplanificada. Este no es un juicio político legítimo. Los republicanos quieren lanzarle un atractivo a su base para mantener su interés. Ellos saben que su magra mayoría está desapareciendo y quieren hacerle un juicio político al secretario Mayorkas, aunque saben que no hay base para mantener el control de la Cámara. Ciertamente, los republicanos no van a ganar votos con su terrible récord legislativo. Este ha sido el Congreso menos productivo del que se tenga memoria. Votaron al presidente de la Cámara y no pudieron ponerse de acuerdo en uno nuevo. Paralizaron a la Cámara durante semanas mientras peleaban entre sí. Han luchado sobre el tema de los fondos del gobierno y siguen teniéndolo al punto de un cierre. Un miembro fue expulsado por mentir sobre prácticamente todos los aspectos de su vida. Los republicanos han creado este circo en parte para tratar de distraer de sus propias faltas. Ellos lo llevaron al público más recientemente haciendo discursos y posando para fotografías. Pero con toda esta retórica, los republicanos se oponen a aprobar los fondos necesarios para la seguridad en la frontera. Ha tratado de quitarle fondos al personal de la patrulla de fronteras y se han negado a considerar el crédito adicional que pidió el presidente. El mismo presidente de la Cámara dijo recientemente que ni un centavo más para el Departamento de Seguridad Nacional al fin de la cita, hasta que se apruebe la propuesta republicana, aunque él sabe plenamente que esta legislación tiene cero posibilidades de ser promulgada. Debería ser algo impensable que el presidente de la Comisión de Seguridad Nacional amenace con quitarle los fondos al Departamento de Seguridad Nacional, pero eso es lo que ha ocurrido. Estos son fondos que necesita nuestro personal para asegurar la frontera. Los republicanos han querido excusar su oposición diciendo que la patrulla no quiere más fondos, pero eso es falso. En entrevistas con la comisión, los jefes de la patrulla de fronteras apoyan inequívocamente que haya más recursos. Los republicanos lo saben porque estaban allí y tienen las transcripciones. Pero vamos a refrescarles la memoria. Jason Owens, en este momento jefe de la patrulla de fronteras, dijo: siempre necesitamos más agentes. En Tucson, el jefe Bodlin dijo: en la agencia necesitamos mucha más gente. El jefe Heitke de San Diego: siempre necesitamos recursos y tecnología. El jefe Bovino en el centro: los recursos adicionales y la tecnología ayudarán a controlar la frontera. Y finalmente, el jefe Chávez en El Paso: darle apoyo a posiciones cruciales y recursos por parte del Congreso ciertamente tiene un impacto positivo en la movilización de agentes al frente. Cada uno de estos jefes le ha dicho a la comisión que tener más recursos les va a ayudar a garantizar la seguridad en la frontera. Los republicanos van a la frontera muy bien vestidos para posar por fotografías, pero luego dejan a los agentes en uniforme y botas atrás sin los recursos que han pedido. Los demócratas quieren darle a los agentes lo que necesitan para garantizar la seguridad en la frontera, pero los republicanos no. La verdad es que la seguridad en la frontera no es la prioridad fundamental de los republicanos. Si lo fuera, le darían a la gente que está trabajando en el terreno lo que necesita para hacer su trabajo. Los republicanos prefieren explorar estos temas políticos de acuerdo con su agenda política. Ellos incluso concuerdan con las políticas, pero les molesta que este gobierno no arrebate bebés a sus madres o ponga niños en jaulas como lo hizo el gobierno anterior. No se le puede hacer un juicio político a un miembro del gabinete porque no le gustan las políticas del presidente. Déjenme reiterarlo. No pueden hacerle un juicio político a un miembro del gabinete porque no le gustan las políticas del presidente. Este proceso no es para eso. Eso no es lo que dice la Constitución. Los republicanos están dispuestos a hacerle un grave daño a la Constitución que dicen valorar porque piensan que esto les va a dar beneficios políticos. Y en este proceso han hecho blanco al secretario Mayorkas, un servidor público que ha dedicado 30 años a servir al país como fiscal federal y en posiciones de liderazgo en el Departamento de Seguridad Nacional. La realidad demuestra que el secretario Mayorkas está haciendo su trabajo en las múltiples misiones del departamento, incluyendo seguridad fronteriza y control de inmigración. A pesar de lo que los republicanos quieren que los estadounidenses crean, el secretario Mayorkas sí está haciendo que se cumplan las leyes de inmigración. Un análisis reciente del Instituto Cato dice que alguien que cruza la frontera bajo este gobierno tiene más probabilidades de ser deportado que alguien que hubiera cruzado bajo el gobierno del presidente Trump. A los republicanos esto no les importa. Esta farsa no se trata de la realidad o de la ley. Pura y simplemente Es una cuestión política. Basta con ver quiénes han presentado resoluciones a esta comisión. Piensen en los tratos a los que habrán hecho con los miembros más extremos de MAGA. Un miembro republicano decía recientemente, simplemente estamos complaciendo a los miembros menos flexibles de nuestra fracción. Y yo estoy de acuerdo. Van a hacer todo lo posible para frenar el caos. Los demócratas quieren más seguridad en la frontera, queremos impedir que el fentanilo llegue a las calles, queremos velar por la seguridad en las calles. Este circo no hace nada de eso. Señor presidente, vamos a parar este proceso y vamos a comenzar a hacer el trabajo de asegurar al país para el bien del pueblo estadounidense. Antes de ceder la palabra, señor presidente, quisiera hacer algunas preguntas. Proceda. No es cierto, señor presidente, que no hay lenguaje en la regla 10 o en la regla 11 que le dé a esta comisión jurisdicción para el juicio político a un funcionario del gobierno. No es una solicitud válida. Usted tiene que leer la regla y decir cómo se aplica en este caso. Por eso dije una pregunta, porque me refiero a la regla 10 o a la regla 11, que si le da a esta comisión jurisdicción para juicio político a cualquier funcionario. Hubo un voto en la Cámara bajo una moción de los demócratas para presentar estos cargos ante esta comisión. Esto se aprobó en el Pleno de la Cámara y estamos procediendo de acuerdo a instrucciones de la Cámara por voto de sus miembros. Otra pregunta. ¿Sabe la presidencia que de las 5 resoluciones contra el secretario Mayorkas, solo una hasta ahora, la 863, ha sido remitida a la Comisión de Seguridad Nacional y que otras 4 han sido remitidas por el presidente a la Comisión de Asuntos Judiciales? Nuevamente, tengo que saber cuál es la regla que usted considera que se está violando. Así que el proceso no es correcto. No le comprendo. No es una solicitud parlamentaria válida. Una más, señor presidente. ¿Le pueden informar a la comisión dónde se apoya la idea que la moción de referir estas excepciones para la jurisdicción de las comisiones, especialmente sobre asuntos constitucionales, si esto debe ser remitido a la Comisión de Asuntos Judiciales? No es una consulta válida. Una más. Tiene la palabra. El Pleno de la Cámara autorizó este proceso de juicio político como lo hizo el 14 de enero de 1876 para la investigación del secretario Ward, o como lo hizo en diciembre del 2023 para la investigación del presidente Biden. Nuevamente, no es una solicitud válida. La Cámara de Representantes votó para remitir el caso a esta comisión. Una más. ¿Sabe la presidencia que la Comisión de Asuntos Judiciales adoptó reglas internas o procedimientos para realizar la investigación del juicio político del presidente Trump y tienen la intención de adoptar otras normas para asegurar el debido proceso para el secretario Mayorkas, y esto todavía no ha sido autorizado? Nuevamente, no es una solicitud válida. Una más. tiene la palabra. En referencia al derecho del secretario al debido proceso, señor presidente, la comisión tiene la intención de permitirle al secretario tener representación legal durante este proceso. La comisión va a seguir las reglas de la Cámara en esa medida. Debo entonces entender que el secretario Mayorkas podrá tener representación. La comisión va a seguir las reglas de la Cámara. Una más. La comisión va a permitir que los abogados del secretario estén presentes en todas las audiencias y declaraciones juradas. La comisión va a seguir las reglas de la Cámara. Una más. La comisión le va a permitir a los abogados del presidente que presenten evidencia y objeten evidencia presentada. La comisión va a seguir las reglas de la Cámara. ¿Es eso, no? La comisión va a seguir las reglas de la Cámara. Mi pregunta es, ¿las reglas lo permiten? Vamos a seguir las reglas de la Cámara tal como están escritas y la pregunta no es pertinente a esta audiencia. Bueno, creo que en algún momento llegaremos a ese punto, señor presidente, pero quiero que quede en el récord que cuando el expresidente Trump enfrentó el caso de juicio político, el senador Lindsey Graham se aseguró que tuviera asesoría legal y todo lo demás. Y queremos saber si vamos a tener cierto tipo de orden en ese sentido. Como le he dicho, vamos a seguir las reglas de la Cámara. Gracias. Una más. La comisión tiene la intención de permitir que los abogados del secretario interroguen a testigos. Nuevamente se van a seguir las reglas de la Cámara. Una más. La comisión tiene la intención de darle a los abogados del secretario acceso a y la capacidad de responder a evidencia presentada por la comisión. La comisión va a seguir todas las reglas de la Cámara. Gracias, señor presidente. Cedo la palabra. Gracias. Otros miembros de la comisión, recuerden que pueden someter para el récord sus declaraciones. Tengo un distinguido grupo de testigos con nosotros. Pido a los testigos que se pongan de pie y levanten su mano derecha. ¿Juran ustedes que el testimonio que darán a la Comisión de Seguridad Nacional en la Cámara de Representantes será la verdad, toda la verdad y solamente la verdad, con la ayuda de Dios? Dejamos constancia de que respondieron afirmativamente. Gracias. Pueden tomar asiento. Quisiera presentarles ahora formalmente a nuestros testigos. El señor Knudsen, Austin Knudsen, el 25º fiscal de Montana en 2021. Fue elegido a la Cámara de Representantes de Montana en 2010. De 2015 a 2019 sirvió como presidente de la Cámara de Representantes de Montana. Gardner Drummond fue juramentado como 19º fiscal general de Oklahoma en enero de 2023. Su experiencia cubre más de 20 años e incluye servicios como fiscal adjunto en el condado de Osage y como abogado en práctica privada. Andrew Bailey fue juramentado en el estado de Missouri el 3 de enero de 2023. El señor Bailey es un veterano del ejército de Estados Unidos y sirvió en combate como oficial después de los ataques terroristas del 11 de septiembre. El señor Frank Bowman, profesor emérito de la Universidad de Missouri y profesor en la Escuela de Leyes de la Universidad de Missouri. También ha tenido cátedras en la Universidad de Gonzaga, McKinney, Lake Forest y la Universidad de Denver. Y en la primavera de 2023 estuvo en el Centro Reuters de la universidad. Tiene la palabra el señor Knudsen por 5 minutos para un sumario de su declaración inicial. Gracias, señor presidente, miembros de la comisión, congresista Green, congresista Thompson. Soy Austin Knudsen, fiscal general de Montana. Como fiscal general y principal funcionario legal del estado de Montana, me complace estar en esta audiencia para hablar de cómo el fallido liderazgo del secretario Mayorkas ha afectado a mi estado. La frontera sur es un reto notable para cualquier gobierno, pero el secretario Mayorkas y el gobierno Biden absolutamente han tirado gasolina en este incendio. La frontera sur y las drogas que están llegando a comunidades grandes y pequeñas de nuestra nación son la razón por la que soy fiscal de Montana en el día de hoy. Yo vengo de la zona rural de Montana, donde ejercía la práctica privada, hasta que 2 narcotraficantes pasaron frente a la escuela de mi hijo, disparándose mutuamente a pleno día. Después de ese incidente, fui elegido como fiscal y vi las peores cosas posibles. Bebés nacidos con adicción a drogas, niños en hogares de acogida porque sus padres no podían velar por ellos, jóvenes violadas por familiares bajo la influencia de drogas, homicidios vinculados con las drogas. Así que se queda corto decir que estos son los motivos de mis acciones. Yo veo con horror cómo este gobierno, bajo el liderazgo del secretario Mayorkas, ha borrado el progreso que se había logrado hasta entonces y han echado por tierra programas que concebían o buscaban la seguridad en la frontera. El impacto más devastador en Montana ha sido una cantidad masiva de fentanilo proveniente de México. Fentanilo y metanfetaminas. En 2020, las fuerzas antidrogas de Montana incautaron más de 6.000 dosis de fentanilo. En 2021, el primer año de gestión del secretario Mayorkas, la cantidad explotó 10 veces a 61.000 dosis de fentanilo. En 2022 se triplicó esa cifra. Se incautaron más de 190.000 dosis de fentanilo. Todavía no tenemos las cifras de 2023, pero les puedo decir que para el tercer trimestre del año, Montana le apuntaba a casi 500.000 de dosis de fentanilo y además metanfetaminas. 100% de esta droga entró por la frontera sur. En solo una semana, 17 personas en la reservación Blackfeet murieron por sobredosis de fentanilo. 4 murieron. Hablé con una mujer de Fort Peck, de la reservación. Yo soy de allí. Ella está criando a sus nietos porque sus 2 hijos murieron en 2 casos separados de sobredosis de fentanilo. En todo el país, los pueblos indígenas están sufriendo la tasa más elevada de sobredosis de fentanilo. En Montana, la situación entre los indígenas estadounidenses duplica la incidencia en la población blanca. El secretario Mayorkas se ha negado a hacer que se cumplan las leyes, atender las causas y deja el problema en el regazo de las familias. Esto lleva a situaciones terribles. Un sospechoso en un caso en Montana estaba recogiendo drogas provenientes de México y tenía a su hija viviendo en una casa y permitió que quienes proveían la droga violaran a su hija como parte del negocio. En otro caso, una joven madre sin hogar finalmente encontró hogar en una casa sin saber que recientemente esto lo había usado un usuario de fentanilo. Apenas poco después que se mudó, la madre encontró a su bebé que no podía respirar. Afortunadamente, el personal médico respondió rápidamente y le administraron naloxona, pero esto mató al niño. El gobierno de Trump enfrentó enorme oposición y con todo esto pudo ponerle un control sin precedentes a la frontera, pero todo ese progreso ha sido destruido. El secretario Mayorkas es el arquitecto de esa destrucción. El pueblo estadounidense está observando, saben que la frontera era segura hace solo unos años, han visto cómo la devastación se ha propagado en nuestras comunidades. La conclusión es clara, el secretario Mayorkas ha violado su juramento y yo insto a este cuerpo a que le hagan un juicio político. Tiene la palabra el señor Drummond para un sumario. Gracias. Gracias, miembros de la comisión, por invitarme a participar en esta audiencia. Yo fui elegido fiscal general de Oklahoma en 2022. Es mi responsabilidad proteger a los pobladores de mi estado. Estoy aquí para hablar de los peligros que enfrentan nuestros ciudadanos debido a una frontera porosa y a las faltas del gobierno federal para que se cumplan las leyes. El 20 de noviembre de 2022, las autoridades acudieron a un homicidio cuádruple en una finca de marihuana en Oklahoma. Según los investigadores, los atacantes mataron a 3 individuos estilo ejecución, disparándoles en la parte de atrás de la cabeza, y a una mujer le dispararon al abdomen. Este es solo un ejemplo trágico de un sistema resultante de un liderazgo fallido. En Oklahoma, las autoridades encuentran cada día a extranjeros que han ingresado ilegalmente al país o que están aquí ilegalmente o ambos casos. Esto es muy común en las operaciones clandestinas de producción de marihuana en Oklahoma. El uso médico de marihuana fue aprobado y aunque esto ha dado pie a un negocio legítimo, también le ha permitido a criminales aprovecharse del sistema. Nuestros funcionarios dicen que muchas veces los extranjeros a cargo de esto vienen de China y México. Un elemento común es que no les importan ni nuestras leyes ni la seguridad pública. Estos inmigrantes ilegales no se limitan al mercado negro de marihuana, también producen fentanilo y se dedican también al tráfico de personas. En Oklahoma estamos luchando constantemente contra estos problemas. La Oficina de Investigaciones de Oklahoma y nuestros cuerpos policiales merecen reconocimiento por sus heroicos esfuerzos. Aunque ha habido muchos éxitos, la creciente crisis es alimentada por un influjo continuo de inmigrantes ilegales perpetrando crímenes que afectan a nuestra gente. Cuando me juramenté, le prometí a la gente de mi estado que haría todo lo posible para protegerlos de estos criminales peligrosos. Le he pedido más recursos a la legislatura y mayor autoridad para combatir esta amenaza. Han respondido con millones de dólares para equipo y personal y le han dado a mi oficina más poder para luchar contra esta epidemia, alentada por la crisis en la frontera. En respuesta, estableció una fuerza contra el crimen organizado, la primera de su tipo en Oklahoma, necesaria particularmente porque los funcionarios federales no han hecho que se cumplan las leyes ni han asegurado la frontera. En los cortos 7 meses desde su creación, esta fuerza ha investigado y procesado más de 50 complejos casos multijurisdiccionales. En la mayoría de los casos involucran a grupos de narcotraficantes mexicanos o chinos. Esto le genera costos adicionales a mi estado que no se pueden cuantificar. Por ejemplo, el Departamento de Correccionales de Oklahoma informa que en este momento tienen más de 500 individuos convictos por crímenes violentos. Antes que estos individuos fueran enviados al Departamento Correccional, estaban en cárceles comunes, generando costos enormes para las autoridades policiales y para los fiscales a cargo de los casos. La frontera insegura también afecta al sistema de justicia criminal. No es posible dar un número preciso del costo si podemos entender la magnitud del problema. Esto le cuesta a los contribuyentes de Oklahoma más de 700 millones de dólares cada año. Señor presidente, miembros de la comisión, creo que ya es hora de que haya responsabilidad. El pueblo de Oklahoma no tiene por qué vivir bajo una amenaza permanente de criminales foráneos. Nosotros no tenemos por qué tener a nuestras comunidades agobiadas por drogas ilegales o lidiar con una frontera insegura y no tenemos por qué perder a nuestros seres queridos por esas drogas. Recuerden a las víctimas, recuerden a las muertes y a las familias enlutadas. Y por favor, recuerden al personal policial que arriesga sus vidas todos los días para protegernos a todos. Gracias, señor Drummond. Tiene la palabra el señor Bailey por 5 minutos. Distinguidos miembros de la Comisión, gracias por la oportunidad de comparecer ante ustedes. Mi entendimiento de este problema viene de experiencia directa por la seguridad de nuestro país. Esto fue algo que aprendí en un vehículo Bradley durante la guerra. Mi pelotón fue enviado a Nínive, en Irak, bajo el comando del general McMaster, para garantizar la seguridad en la frontera entre Irak y Siria. La misión era simple: cerrar la frontera. Y eso fue exactamente lo que hicimos. No capturábamos gente y la poníamos en libertad en el país. No les dábamos citaciones y les pedimos que se reportaran en 10 años. No, cerramos la frontera para garantizar la seguridad del país. Desde 2021, más de 8 millones de inmigrantes ilegales han ingresado a Estados Unidos, y eso es más que la población de mi estado, Missouri. Estos no son cifras accidentales. Hay una razón por la que están cruzando las fronteras de una nación soberana, porque saben que pueden hacerlo. ¿Y por qué no iba a ser así? En los últimos 3 años, bajo la gestión del secretario Mayorkas, ha habido una falta coordinada de cumplimiento de nuestras leyes. Él no ha cumplido la parte fundamental de su misión: proteger nuestras fronteras. Esto no solamente lleva a este procedimiento, sino que nos lleva a un nivel sin precedentes de medidas necesarias para llenar el vacío creado por la negativa del secretario de hacer su trabajo. Quisiera destacar algunas de las acciones que está haciendo mi oficina en nuestra lucha por defender la frontera sur. Uno de esos esfuerzos es para finalizar el muro fronterizo que comenzó el presidente Trump. El secretario Mayorkas decía que se necesitaban fondos. Él tiene los fondos, pero se niega a usarlos. En el año 2020, el fondo aprobó fondos para construir barreras en la frontera sur para evitar que individuos no autorizados entraran al país. Y se establecía claramente que el dinero solamente se podía usar para la construcción de estas barreras en la frontera suroeste. El secretario Mayorkas y su gobierno se negaron a acatar la orden del Congreso. Después trataron de decir que no tenían por qué usar los fondos bajo esa norma, pero la Corte de Apelaciones determinó que los estados sí pueden intervenir. Esto llevó a una querella contra el secretario por la negativa del secretario a completar el muro fronterizo. Así que mientras teníamos esta batalla en la Corte, el secretario Mayorkas se ha negado a utilizar fondos públicos tal como lo ha instruido el Congreso. Tenemos poca simpatía por ello. El secretario Mayorkas ha estado adoptando políticas que hacen más fácil entrar ilegalmente al país. Presentamos una querella contra el secretario Mayorkas por permitir que cientos de miles de inmigrantes ilegales sean puestos en libertad bajo palabra en Estados Unidos. Esto permite que estos individuos se queden en el país por 2 años o más mientras sus solicitudes son revisadas. También presentamos una querella para frenar la tentativa del secretario Mayorkas de adoptar una regla de redefinir los cruces ilegales de la frontera. En lugar de enfrentar las causas de fondo, el secretario trató de redefinir el problema, haciendo que algo que era ilegal fuera ahora legal sin autorización del Congreso. Esto permite que un gran número de inmigrantes ilegales entren al país y reciban instantáneamente autorizaciones de trabajo bajo procedimientos irregulares. Estas acciones ilegales están abriendo la frontera sur. Sin asumir la responsabilidad por sus acciones, son los estados los que tienen que cubrir el costo de las faltas del secretario Mayorkas. Los estados no tienen por qué hacer el trabajo del gobierno federal. El secretario Mayorkas debe hacer que se cumplan las leyes del país. En Missouri, cuando un funcionario no cumple con sus funciones, es destituido, porque sabemos del impacto catastrófico en la comunidad. Nosotros tuvimos que hacer esto con una fiscal que se negó a desempeñar sus funciones, resultando en la muerte de incontables residentes de Missouri. Es pertinente, pues, que el Congreso haga lo mismo con un funcionario federal que se niega a cumplir con su función. Hemos llegado al punto de no retorno. Tenemos que enfrentar este desastre. El Congreso tiene una función en este sentido. Hay que usar todos los recursos disponibles para que haya responsabilidad ante el pueblo estadounidense. Le agradezco a la Comisión por su tiempo y por sus preguntas. Gracias, señor Bailey. Señor Bowman, tiene 5 minutos para una sinopsis de su declaración. Legislador Green, Thompson, miembros de la comisión. Es un honor hablarle a esta comisión y compartir la mesa de testigos con varios testigos. Como fiscal de Missouri, él es conocido en el mundo. Felicitaciones. Yo sigo siendo un profesor en el entretanto. Entiendo que esta es la primera serie de audiencias sobre si hay base constitucional para un juicio político del secretario Mayorkas. Hasta ahora el testimonio se ha concentrado en el desempeño del secretario Mayorkas y del gobierno Biden en cuanto a política de inmigración. Yo no soy un experto en política de inmigración y no voy a comentar sobre eso aquí. Sin embargo, sí he estado estudiando estándares constitucionales de juicio político durante 25 años. He escrito múltiples artículos y un libro sobre este proceso desde sus orígenes en Inglaterra hasta juicios políticos al presidente Trump. Voy a hablar entonces de los estándares constitucionales para el juicio político miembro del gabinete. El punto clave aquí es que esta no es una herramienta rutinaria para zanjar divergencias políticas, por marcadas que sean. Los debates de este tipo se manejan a otro nivel. Esta es una medida reservada para situaciones graves. En otras palabras, para mala conducta oficial, particularmente en acciones que subvierten procesos constitucionales o el orden constitucional. El objetivo de hacer de este proceso un caso raro nos lleva al hecho de que este no es o debe ser un instrumento de debate político. La Constitución establece que el presidente, el vicepresidente y otros funcionarios de Estados Unidos deben ser destituidos bajo juicio político por faltas o delitos graves. Un miembro del gabinete está sujeto a esto, pero como el presidente, solamente se le puede hacer un juicio político si se demuestra que ha cometido estas faltas. No he visto sugerencias que el secretario Mayorkas haya cometido estas faltas, así que habría que demostrar esta parte primero. El concepto adopta el término crímenes graves y faltas severas porque querían un término flexible que pudiera cubrir formas no anticipadas de mala conducta oficial, pero también porque no querían un juicio político que fuera similar a un voto de censura, como existe en otros sistemas parlamentarios. Esto se hace cuando alguien no aprueba la gestión de un funcionario gubernamental. Durante 2 siglos, se ha aceptado que cuando hay base para juicio político, ciertamente uno de esos motivos no es el que no le gusten a uno las políticas de un presidente. La conducta oficial tiene que tener parámetros claramente definidos. Debe tratarse de una situación que corrompa y subvierta procesos gubernamentales y debe ser demostrable más allá de tecnicismos legales. Las categorías más notables son corrupción, abuso de poder, traición a los intereses del país y subversión de la Constitución. Que yo sepa, no ha habido alegaciones que el secretario haya hecho nada de esto. Se ha descrito como un abuso de poder la forma en que el secretario ha puesto en práctica las políticas del presidente. Pero esto es un problema en cuanto a que se haga para obtener beneficios personales o para perjudicar a adversarios políticos, o especialmente cuando el ejercicio del poder político socava valores constitucionales. Siguiendo estas directrices, cuando se siguen las políticas dispuestas por un superior, eso no es un abuso de poder. Finalmente, el juicio político a un miembro del gabinete no solamente es contrario con el entendimiento constitucional de larga data, sino también es un asunto práctico. Si se destituye al secretario, esto no cambia nada porque él está siguiendo las órdenes de su superior. Las políticas migratorias del gobierno de Biden, la Constitución le da al Congreso una amplia gama de poderes para cambiar las normas, pero esto no cubre el juicio político.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. This is for the three attorneys general. Do you believe that Secretary Mayorkas has failed to enforce or has subverted laws passed by the United States Congress? And we'll start and go left to right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, yes or no?
Yes, sir.
He has failed to perform his duties and is culpably inefficient.
Has he failed to enforce laws passed by the U.S. Congress?
He has.
Yes, sir. Secretary Mayorkas is acting in violation of the law and in violation of constitutional order by negating Congress's appropriations authority and directives in the appropriations bill and undermining the rule of law by perverting the plain text of the statutes as it relates to the parole process and its promulgation of the circumvention rule.
Thank you. Do you believe that Secretary Mayorkas, again, we're going to hit the three of you, do you believe that Secretary Mayorkas has defied court orders issued by the United States courts, which I can cite if you want me to, but I'm sure you're probably aware of them. Do you believe that Secretary Mayorkas has defied court orders issued by the courts, federal courts?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Yes, and it should never come to having to go to court against Secretary Mayorkas because he should be following the laws enacted by this body.
Thank you. In testimony to Chip Roy before the House of Representatives, you saw some of the video there, the Secretary said yes to the question of whether DHS possessed operational control of the southwest border as defined by the Secure Fence Act. I might add, act, meaning the Congress passed it. In subsequent testimony to the Senate, Secretary Mayorkas stated that no one has ever had operational control of the border and that he does not use that definition of operational control as defined by the Secure Fence Act. Given these statements, do you believe that Secretary Mayorkas misled Congress while under oath in describing DHS's operational control of the border? Again, gentlemen, the three of you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do.
I believe that he politicized his answer and failed to be authentic.
Yes, absolutely.
Attorney General Merrick Garland acknowledged in testimony to the United States Senate that drug cartels were exploiting the current Mayorkas policies in order to traffic humans and harmful drugs into the United States. Secretary Mayorkas on March 28, 23 stated that he was unaware of this. Now, we of course informed him, now armed with this knowledge, Mayorkas continues the same policies, in fact doubling down with newer policies that even exacerbate the same horrible outcomes. Do you think Secretary Mayorkas is doing this with full knowledge that these cartels are exploiting his policies?
Mr. Chairman, there's no doubt there's ample evidence out there that human trafficking and drug trafficking are increasing at an exponential level at the southern border, yes.
And Mr. Chairman, based on my testimony today and the facts that are well known by the Secretary, there's a porous border that's feeding constantly illegal actors in Oklahoma.
Ms. Bailey.
Yes, his unlawful behaviors as it relates to the circumvention rule and subversion of the parole process exacerbate and encourage the cartels and cede control of the border to the cartels in ways unimaginable prior to these policy positions.
Thank you. Where impeachment is concerned, the scale is very important. How would you describe the scale or comparable size of this border crisis based on your law enforcement experience? And we'll start with Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Based on my prior prosecuting experience, I can tell you since 2020, the fentanyl and human trafficking specifically, fentanyl and methamphetamine trafficking have increased in my state. There's no other word than meteoric. I can tell you about the first fentanyl case that I prosecuted in 2019. That was a relatively small amount by today's standards, but at the time we thought that was a large bust. And again, that was in 2019. Our seizure numbers from our various drug task forces, our various federal partnerships bear that out categorically. Fentanyl in Montana is by far our largest public safety issue, and it's just exploded under this administration. Our seizure numbers bear that out.
I'm going to go ahead and sort of interrupt my own question because my time is running out. I know Mr. Bowman mentioned the term great and dangerous threat to the United States. I'll ask the last two of you, do you feel that the hundreds of thousands who've died to fentanyl overdose, the crime that's exponentially increased, the increase in terrorist activity, or terrorists coming across the southern border, do you think it's great and dangerous, Mr. Drennan?
It is great and dangerous. We have collision between Chinese and Mexican cartels.
Mr. Bailey, very quickly.
Yes, absolutely. The Missouri State Highway Patrol, a single law enforcement agency in the state of Missouri last year, seized 12,500 grams of fentanyl. That's enough to kill every Missourian.
Thank you, and I yield. I now recognize the ranking member for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've been on this committee since its inception and have served as a top Democrat since 2005. During that time, Democrats and Republicans have engaged in spirited debate over policy, both with each other and with various administrations. At the end of the day, however, we always came together to make the homeland more secure for the American people. This has been our committee's reputation, and as a point of pride for me and all my Republican counterparts, from chairs and ranking members. Today marks a dramatic shift from the committee's record of sensible bipartisan policymaking. We used to come together to resolve policy disputes, but now Republicans are trying to use the awesome power of impeachment instead. The Constitution doesn't let us do that. The Constitution requires high crimes and misdemeanors. Professor Bowman, has Secretary Mayorkas, in your opinion, committed high crimes and misdemeanors to meet that requirement?
Based on all the information available to me, I have not found any indication that he's committed high crimes and misdemeanors, no.
Thank you. Over the weekend, we observed the 3rd anniversary of the January 6th insurrection, during which thousands of angry Trump supporters who had whipped into a frenzy by Donald Trump marched from the White House to the Capitol to obstruct the democratic process. And let's be clear, those individuals were acting on the orders of Donald Trump, who told them, quote, "We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're going to not have a country anymore," unquote. That night, most of us were unified in our disgust over the attack on the Capitol and the democratic process. Almost immediately, however, that unity eroded. In the end, only 10 Republicans voted to impeach Donald Trump for engaging in high crimes and misdemeanors by inciting violence against the government of the United States. Professor Bowman, as a constitutional expert, would you agree that inciting an insurrection to obstruct a peaceful transfer of power is an impeachable offense?
I do agree, and I think it's notable that not only did 10 members of this body vote to impeach Donald Trump, but when the case went to trial in the Senate, 7 Republican members of the Senate voted for that precise proposition. There was indeed a majority for convicting Mr. Trump of high crimes and misdemeanors, albeit not the 2/3 majority that was required under the Constitution.
And yet only 10 Republicans voted to impeach Donald Trump for conduct that is clearly an impeachable offense. But today, Republicans are attempting to impeach Secretary Mayorkas where there are clearly no grounds. Mr. Chairman, this impeachment is a sham and the height of hypocrisy on the part of my colleagues across the aisle. I urge Republicans to put politics aside and get back to the work for the American people. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a solemn occasion, probably the most serious obligation we have in this committee, on this committee. The last time a cabinet member was impeached was during the administration of Ulysses S. Grant many years ago. In my experience, though, as a Deputy Attorney General for Criminal Justice, state of Texas, as a federal prosecutor charged with counterterrorism and national security, and as chairman of this very committee, I've never seen this border more out of control. Mayorkas took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. In my judgment, he has violated that oath. Federal law provides the government detain and remove aliens convicted of crimes and those who are issued removal orders by immigration courts. This is the very issue that my state took up on appeal to the Supreme Court. He has violated this. On day one, he rescinded Remain in Mexico Migrant Protection Protocol, direct cause and effect, opening the floodgates. I marked that provision up on my committee, Foreign Affairs. It's now part of H.R. 2. But he took that power away from his law enforcement officers. And I have to quote, I don't quote former Texas Congresswoman Barbara Jordan very often, but she said, quote, "For the system to be credible, people actually have to be deported at the end of the process." And let's look at the numbers. They speak for themselves. 8 million encounters under this administration, 2.3 aliens in the interior of the United States with no legal status, enough to fill up 13 states. Just last month, we had over 300,000 trying to get into the United States. Over 300 on the terror watch list have gotten into the United States. When I chaired this committee, that was a big red flag, and the FBI director said so when he testified as well. Over 200,000 Americans have died from fentanyl. I personally went to a funeral last Saturday. One of my children's friends died from Xanax laced with fentanyl. 200,000 Americans, that's more than triple the number of Americans who died in the Vietnam War, to put that into perspective. The Secretary has emboldened a criminal enterprise and the biggest human trafficking scheme in my lifetime. He terminated MPP. Chief Ortiz noted that had a direct cause and effect. And when Mayorkas went down to the border, they turned their backs on him because, quote, "Sir, you have turned your back on us." My state has spent almost $14 billion just this cycle. We've allocated $9.6 billion to Operation Lone Star. My governor bussed illegals to sanctuary cities and states around the country to showcase what we are experiencing, and you are as well in your states, every single day. And the damage was clear. The Supreme Court did note the damage, but said that this had to be resolved outside the courts. In other words, they said that Congress had to address this either through appropriations, oversight, and in Sam Alito's decision, yes, through impeachment. This is the legal justification for these proceedings. The founders believed impeachable offenses included corrupt administration, neglect of duty, and official misconduct. At the Constitutional Convention, they said this. Alexander Hamilton asserted abuse or violation of public trust was impeachable. Justice Story, Supreme Court, public office is a public trust, and a violation of public trust is sufficient. I find this to be a profound violation of public trust. Alexander Hamilton stated in Federalist Paper 65, the subjects of impeachment are a nature which may be denounced political, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to society itself. My God, what about the injuries done to society that we've seen? To our three illustrious attorneys general, please tell me the injuries done to your societies back home, and do you think this secretary merits and that impeachment is warranted in this case?
Thank you, Representative. I think the most powerful statistic I can give you from my state is our confirmed state crime lab fentanyl overdose death rate. Since 2019, Montana's confirmed fentanyl overdose deaths have increased 1,700%. Congressman, I think that is the absolute strongest indicator. We know where these drugs are coming from. It's not a political statement of mine, it's not an opinion of mine to say that 100% of that fentanyl came from the Mexican drug cartels. We know that to be true. We get that from our federal partners in the DEA. We get that from all of our drug task forces and all the law enforcement agencies that are under my purview.
Just real quickly, General Drummond and Bailey, just very quickly.
We have witnessed a mass collusion between Chinese nationals coming through the southern border in concert with Mexican cartels.
1,500 fentanyl deaths, 43 children dead from accidental poisoning from exposure to fentanyl, $114 million borne by taxpayers in increased healthcare costs.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas, the gentlelady from Texas, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for yielding. I almost don't know where to start, and certainly will find the 5 minutes to be underwhelming in terms of the time that I need. I do want to express my solemnity and humbleness and expression of appreciation for having the honor of serving on this committee, even in the midst of the horrific 9/11. It seems that this committee always rises to the occasion to be the problem solvers. And I clearly am someone who has lived the immigration story coming from Texas, and I would certainly have a different view than my friend and colleague who has just spoken about the actions that have been taken as children and families have been manipulated as if they are inhuman. I do think that one of the highest callings of this committee is, in fact, to do the bidding of solving the nation's immigration problems. And as a member of the Judiciary Committee, I have over the years introduced comprehensive immigration reform legislation year after year after year. And so I am certainly willing and able to be part of the solution for the 3 attorney generals, of which I am a lawyer, certainly served in capacities to realize the important work that you do. But I must join in the sadness of this day. The sadness of this day because it is not constitutionally grounded, it is not constitutionally sound, it is not going to save any lives at all, and there is nothing that you have put forward today that evidences in any way a impeachable offense by Secretary Mayorkas, the first immigrant to serve in this position. A dislike of the president's policy is not a basis for impeachment. A basis for impeachment is corruption, abuse of power, betrayal of the nation, and that is, of course, allegations. You, as witnesses, I am sorry to say, Mr. Chairman, have borne no testimony that indicates that Secretary Mayorkas has done any of that. So I thank the ranking member for his earlier eloquent words on this shameful, fraudulent impeachment inquiry, where we're not fixing the immigration issues that my constituents in Houston need. At the onset, I'm reminded of the words of the Representative Barbara Jordan, complete difference from what I heard her quoted before. I know that she did an excellent job in trying to frame the immigration issues of years past. My predecessor represented Houston like I do. She endorsed me, glad to say a mentor. Like her, my faith in the Constitution is whole. It is complete, it is total. And I'm not going to sit here and be an idle spectator of the diminution, the subversion, the destruction of the Constitution. Because the Constitution said to create a more perfect union, to instill justice. That is what this inquiry is, a diminution, a subversion, and a destruction of the Constitution of the United States. I cannot stand for that. Mr. Chairman, impeachment is one of the absolute powers Congress has to ensure against an executive might, as James Madison explained at the Constitutional Convention, quote, pervert his administration into a scheme of speculation or oppression. The men present in Philadelphia some 236 years ago were deliberate. They were intentional. They were exacting in their draft of the Constitution that has guided us forever. These are their words, and the words of our Constitution, the legal standard by which we are solemnly consider whether to exercise this extraordinary power. Article 2, Section 4 guides, and I quote, the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for the conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanor. That is our standard. Treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors. Professor Bowman, in your review of Congressman Green's impeachment resolution, which was referred to this committee, and in your review of the various reports by committee Republicans, have you identified any actions by Secretary Mayorkas that reach the constitutional threshold of impeachment, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors? Professor?
No.
In all of the reports, have you seen any evidence of such? The reports you've been able to secure or the reports that I brought your attention to?
I've seen lots of reports about arguments about policy. I've seen nothing that rises to the level of an impeachable offense.
And so, Mr. Chairman, if the Constitution is to be our guide, we must end this political stunt that seeks to impeach an officer of the United States because an extremist minority of the House of Representatives does not agree with the policies of this president or that he carries out. Let's work with these attorney generals to solve the real problems, to not incarcerate children, to separate them from their family. Treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors is our legal standard. It is clear. That is the basis from which we must proceed. That is the constitutional bar you have failed to reach. We created this book, as they say, to create a more perfect union and to establish justice. Gentlemen, you have law degrees and have taken an oath as I have, and you've taken an oath to procure the rights of your citizens. Please sit with us to establish justice for all of America, for the work you do, and for those who come to seek a better life. However they come, we may perceive in a different light, but let us do it in perceiving justice. You hurt me, you hurt my heart, you hurt what Barbara Jordan stood for. You diminish this book and these words by sitting here today to suggest that Secretary Mayorkas must be, in fact, impeached because of policies that we disagree with. May God continue to guide us in our work so that we can do what we have been assigned to do. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Higgins, the gentleman from Louisiana and the chair of the subcommittee on the border.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My. Mr. Bowman, I wasn't even going to ask you any questions today, but I'm going to give you an opportunity to clarify it for record. And I do believe that, according to your resume, you're a professor of constitutional law, sir. Is that correct?
I am an emeritus professor at the Missouri School of Law.
You're a smart guy. You got an alphabet behind your name on your business card. So is it your position that you're taking today as a Democrat's witness that the founders' intent with the term high crimes and misdemeanors was designed to restrict the power of impeachment to a violation of specific written statute? Is that your position? We're listening.
Yes, and
that is your position. Okay, and you're
excuse me, Congressman.
You said yes. It's a simple question.
No,
I'm gonna move on.
Excuse me, Congressman.
It clearly was not reclaiming my time. It clearly was not the intention of the founders to limit the power of congressional impeachment over the executive branch, to limit that to violation of written statute.
That's quite correct, Congressman. I've written extensively.
Oh, well, thank you. But you just said something different, but that's all right. We appreciate you being here today, Mr. Bowman, and representing University of Missouri. Sure, it's a wonderful law school. On this committee, we've carried out our investigation of Secretary Mayorkas. I sit here today to tell you, we're going to impeach him. He's going to be impeached, and he should be. He is the executive in charge of the border policy for President Biden. Now, President Biden has the right, as the chief executive, to hire men that don't have the skill and then figure that out down the line and replace them. President Biden also has a right as a chief executive to have wild policy in mind. But the executive that sits on his cabinet, that's in charge of actually enforcing those policies, that has the law enforcement experience to know when those policies are going to bring injury upon our country, that executive has a responsibility to advise the president that his policies are not only not working to secure the border, they're actually bringing injury upon our country. The United States Constitution is the law of the land that we swear our oath to. Secretary Mayorkas has brought generational trauma upon our country. Hundreds of thousands of American lives destroyed, hundreds of thousands dead, millions and millions, wave upon wave of human misery coming across our southern border. We're losing our country down there. My God, my colleagues, you've got to recognize this. We've got to stop this arterial bleed. It's not about money. We spent less money in 2019 than we did in 23, a lot less through DHS, and we had the border under control. It's policy that has changed, and who is driving that policy? Secretary Mayorkas. So who shall be impeached? Quite rightfully so, Secretary Mayorkas. Mr. Knudsen, from your position, sir, and I'm sorry for what you and your people and your community and your state are going through, sir. On behalf of this Congress that has been unable to take action as of yet, I'm sorry for what you're going through. Do you concur with the things that I've spoken on and shared?
I absolutely do concur, Congressman. I think this body is completely within its constitutional and legal right to bring impeachment proceedings here.
Mr. Drummond.
I also concur.
Mr. Bailey.
I concur. The Secretary's abdicated his official duties. He's in dereliction of duty and should be held accountable.
I appreciate all the panelists for being here today. I thank the chairman for his leadership on this issue. He has been calm and patient and judicious in our procedure. We have laid out the case for the impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas. We have promised the American people we would fulfill that somber duty, and we shall. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Payne, the gentleman from New Jersey, for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, today's hearing would be a joke. And let me just put something out here in reference to fentanyl. It is something that is really damaging our country, our young people, obviously. But I remember in the 1980s, when the crack epidemic was prevalent, the First Lady, Nancy Reagan, told folks, just say no. So I think we need to incorporate that into this epidemic. Why is fentanyl killing so many of our folks? Because they're consuming it. We have to look at the demand for it as well. We know we have a problem in stopping it, and we are all hell-bent in doing that. But we also have to look at the demand. Or, as Nancy Reagan said, just say no. But back to the topic at hand. As I stated, this would be a joke if the stakes weren't so high and serious for the reasons laid out by my friend, Ms. Jackson Lee. I'm embarrassed for my Republican colleagues. They pretend that their fraudulent impeachment against Secretary Mayorkas is about high crimes and misdemeanors. That's because they know well, as we do, that this so-called impeachment is nothing more than an extremist MAGA takeover of the committee in this Congress. Just look at who is in the driver's seat of this fraudulent impeachment. It's not the chairman of the committee. It's not even the subcommittee chair. It's an extreme MAGA backbencher who, proverbially speaking, shoved her leadership out of the driver's seat and now has the reins of the Congress and about ready to drive us all off the cliff. The chairman can proclaim that he has led this year-long investigation into Secretary Mayorkas' leadership that led to today's proceedings, but we all know that this is false. We are here because a member of Congress who believes the anti-Semitic conspiracy that Jewish space lasers coming down to Earth caused the deadly wildfires in California in 2018. Someone who has called black people like me slaves to the Democratic Party. A woman who believes serving this great country in the military is throwing your life away. Someone who supports insurrections, who tried to destroy American democracy, who wants to defund the FBI, and someone who mocked survivors of a tragic school shooting. A member of Congress who who believes all that is brought us here. It is not Chairman Green's impeachment resolution that was referred to. This is committee. Chairman Green has not even introduced an impeachment resolution. And it is not Chairman Green's so-called investigation into Secretary Mayorkas that got us here. We had an impeachment resolution before us weeks before the chairman's alleged investigation even concluded. Professor Bowman, do mere policy disputes between members of Congress and a cabinet secretary constitute impeachable high crimes and misdemeanors?
Congressman, they do not. I think the conclusion is universal among those who have studied this question, has been so since the time of the founding, that policy differences, no matter how severe, no matter how heated, are simply not grounds for impeachment.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to request unanimous consent to submit an article from CBS News titled, Marjorie Taylor Greene Backs Off Forcing Vote on Second Alejandro Mayorkas Impeachment Resolution, dated November 30th, 2023.
Without objection, so ordered.
In which Representative Greene is quoted as saying, we need to do this. We need to move forward. So I got guarantees, so we will move forward with impeachment. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Mr. Bowman, it strikes me that how much your opinion has changed in just a few years. It pointed out that in your 2019 book entitled High Crimes and Misdemeanors, A History of Impeachment for the Age of Trump, you have this passage. No Congress since that time, referring to the impeachment of Belknap, the cabinet person that Grant had dismissed before his impeachment. But you say no Congress since that time has either moved fast enough or thought it worthwhile to actually impeach a subordinate executive branch official. Nonetheless, the latent power to do so remains important. And here's the key sentence. Not only is it useful as a signal of legislative displeasure with administration personnel and policy, but the undoubted authority of Congress to impeach subordinate officials carries with it the associated powers of the House to investigate potentially impeachable conduct and of the Senate to try the allegations in articles of impeachment. Now, frankly, sir, I agree with you more today and not then. That is to say, I don't think pure policy differences is the basis for an impeachment. Neither is that what's happening here. It is exceedingly apt for that reason that the majority witnesses are 3 state attorneys general. Gentlemen, I look forward to joining you in 2025. But let me point this out. A lot of people would say, well, American people are interested in hearing something about a legal case. I think they might be. Last June, 2 of your colleagues in Texas and in Louisiana had sued Secretary Mayorkas, saying that guidelines that he issued to his department blatantly violated commands of Congress in statute to detain any criminal who had committed certain crimes and was released from state custody. Were required, the Attorney General then, the Secretary of Homeland Security later by amendment, required to detain such persons until they were deported. And persons subject to a permanent order, a final order of deportation, required to be detained. Contrary to that order, Secretary Mayorkas dismantled the detainer process completely. He said that that was going to be subject to discretion, only in cases where the department or he deems it to imperil our national security or security from additional crime would it be done. Attorneys General sued, and here's what the Supreme Court said. You don't have standing. We can't hear from you. We can't settle this. Here's what Alito said in dissent. The Congress, to put the point simply, Congress enacted a law that requires the apprehension and detention of certain illegal aliens whose release it thought would endanger public safety. The Secretary of DHS does not agree with that categorical requirement. He prefers a more flexible policy. And the court's answer today is that the executive's policy choice prevails unless Congress, by withholding funds, refusing to confirm presidential nominees, threatening impeachment and removal, etc., can win a test of strength. In other words, Alito in defense went on and said, I don't think this is a wise decision for us to make, but that is the decision the majority made. That if you want the law to be followed, you're going to have to impeach somebody. You're going to have to, as Justice Alito said, the Congress is going to have to go to war with the executive. Mr. Knudsen, what about that? Isn't that right? Isn't that what the Congress is put to decide whether to do our duty? As the Supreme Court has said, we can't do it. It's up to the Congress. And you guys have tried to do it. You've succeeded in other areas. You're continuing to sue, and you're succeeding. Florida has enjoined some practices. I think the Supreme Court just granted an emergency relief from the DHS cutting Texas border barrier. What about that, Mr. Knudsen? I didn't leave you a lot of time, but I'm sure you can add more wisdom in 30 seconds than I did into it.
I'll be brief, Congressman. Thank you for the question. Yes, I absolutely agree not only with Justice Alito's dissent, but I would point out also in that case that the majority also pointed out, to your point, that Congress possesses an array of tools to analyze and influence those policies, and those are political checks for the political process. That's exactly what you're dealing with here. You folks have got an executive versus legislative branch war here.
So much of this, Mr. Chairman, isn't about even policy discretion that's granted to the administration. It is about square violations of law. And they will either be, they cannot be remedied in court, they will either be dealt with by this Congress to vindicate the rule of law, or we will surrender rule of law to a rule of man. I yield.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, point of order.
The point of order, you're recognized.
I think we all heard the colleague say he's running for another office, but that violates the Rule 23. And I won't ask that it be taken down. I just ask that if he's going to run, just go run. Just don't run when the committee is in session.
The gentleman has made his point of order, and I now recognize Mr. Swalwell, the gentleman from California, and our ranking member on Cybersecurity Subcommittee for his 5 minutes of questioning.
I want to thank the Attorneys General for participating today. Thank you for your service to your states. I was a prosecutor before coming to Congress. I missed that job. My father was a cop. My brothers are cops. And it seems like we've got a pretty educated group of attorneys general here. Mr. Knudsen, you went to Montana Law School, right?
Yes, Representative.
Great. Pretty good law school. Mr. Bailey, University of Missouri, is that right?
Yes.
And you served our country after September 11 as well.
Yes.
Thank you for doing that. Mr. Drummond, you went to Georgetown, is that right?
I did.
That's a good school. I was rejected there twice for law school and then as a transfer. That's a very good school. I just want to level set where we all are on what's a crime, what's not a crime, because the three of you have offered testimony to my Republican colleagues about what is an impeachable offense. And I just want to go down the list here of some of the potential impeachable offenses that we've seen in the history of the Congress. Bribery, Mr. Knudsen, would you agree that's an impeachable offense?
I would, Congressman.
Mr. Drummond, would you agree bribery is an impeachable offense?
I would.
And Mr. Bailey, would you agree bribery is an impeachable offense?
Yes.
Same as extortion, Mr. Knudsen?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond, extortion?
Yes.
Mr. Bailey?
Yes.
How about obstruction of justice? Would you agree that that's an impeachable offense, Mr. Knudsen?
If there was a conviction, yes.
Okay. Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
And Mr. Bailey?
Yes.
How about inciting violence against police officers? What would you say, Mr. Knudsen?
Again, if there was a conviction of a criminal offense, I think that would certainly rise to the level.
And Mr. Drummond, how about incitement of violence?
Yes.
And Mr. Bailey, incitement of violence?
Would need more facts to make that legal determination. I think that's bereft of sufficient facts.
And Mr. Knudsen, I just want to drill down a little bit because you said if there was a conviction. So are you saying that Mr. Mayorkas should be convicted criminally before he could be impeached?
Congressman, no. I'm simply speaking to your example of would inciting violence against a police officer rise to the level of an impeachable offense. My testimony was if there was a conviction for that crime, then yes.
Okay. And obstruction of justice, you said the same thing, right?
Correct.
But you think for Mr. Mayorkas, he does not need a conviction to be impeached?
Well, as this body has done in its past, I think there's certainly precedent. No, I do not believe there has to be a criminal offense. High crimes and misdemeanors, as it was understood by the founders, as it was understood in the English common law, does not necessarily mean there has to be an actual crime committed.
In the summer of 2019, former President Donald Trump used $300 million of taxpayer dollars to ask President Zelensky of Ukraine to get dirt on his potential primary political opponent, Joe Biden, and he was impeached in the House for that. Should he have been impeached for that, Mr. Knudsen?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I'm not a member of this Congress. I'm not privy to all of that information. I certainly haven't seen a lot of those reports. This body chose to go forward with those proceedings, as is its purview.
Mr. Drummond?
It's outside my lane. I'm just a simple attorney general from Oklahoma.
Mr. Bailey?
I believe President Trump was acquitted of all charges, and that's beyond the purview of my testimony today.
On January 6th, he incited and aimed a violent mob at the Capitol. 6 police officers would later lose their lives. 1 lost a finger, 1 lost an eye. The president was impeached. 10 Republicans voted for that impeachment. Mr. Knudsen, should he have been impeached for that? Yes or no?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, he was.
Okay. Mr. Drummond?
He was impeached for that.
And should he have been?
I don't have an opinion on that issue.
Okay. Mr. Bailey, what do you think about that?
He was acquitted of those charges.
Okay. So what's interesting to me, and again, I respect that you all are here, is that when you've testified to Mr. Mayorkas' conduct and you believe pretty clearly that he can be impeached for his conduct, but when we go through pretty egregious conduct of using taxpayer dollars, of inciting and aiming a mob, having the greatest attack ever on this Congress, this Capitol, our Constitution, you don't want to comment on it at all. And I think what we're really seeing from the majority in all of this is that they're not interested in finding any solution on the border. In fact, what we have seen is that there's a 2014 deal in the Senate, bipartisan. They walked away when they were in the majority. Speaker Johnson has said that he will refuse any additional funding for the border. And now we have witnesses who, again, want to comment only on Mayorkas, but don't want to comment on President Trump. Mr. Chairman, respectfully, I just see a party that does not want to fix, but only wants the fiction. And with that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much. And I was fascinated by my colleagues' questioning, line of questioning. Somewhere I was going to go to, maybe not as quite as eloquently as him. I'm not running for Attorney General or anything. Mr. Bowman, you say in your testimony, written testimony, and some of the foundational requirements for impeachable high crimes and misdemeanors is that they must be extraordinarily seriousness and ought to be of the type that corrupts or subverts governmental processes or the constitutional order. And I find that, I underline that specifically because I wanted to ask you, do you believe that the death of 200,000 Americans from fentanyl overdoses, is that extraordinarily serious?
It's certainly a serious matter, and one that has to be addressed by this body by exercising its constitutional legislative powers to work with the executive branch to address the policy. The problem that you have, that you're confronting here.
That's good. I'm gonna reclaim my time now that you've answered the question. Thank you very much. Okay, and it ought to be of the type that corrupts or subverts governmental processes or the constitutional order. Now, I'm not a constitutional scholar, et cetera, but I do believe that the Constitution is set up to have three distinct branches of government. You have legislative, you have judicial, and then you have the administrative branch. And the founding fathers wanted a balance of power. Is that what you get from the Constitution and the founding fathers, what they wanted to do? The balance of power? Mr. Bowman?
Indeed.
Okay. And so it's up to the legislative branch to actually create the laws, and the will of Congress is supposed to be then carried out by the administrative branch. Am I off on that, or is that what the founding fathers thought should have happened?
In general, yes.
Okay. And so we have this issue of policy versus law. And if I get you right, you believe that this is a question of policy, but I don't believe it's a question of policy. I believe it's actually a question of violating the law. The law clearly states that people coming into the United States or people seeking asylum in the United States, two things happen to them. They're either detained here in country, or they're detained in another country waiting the outcome of their asylum hearing. That's what the law says. The law also says that the executive branch actually has the right to parole, but on a case-by-case basis, not mass parole. And so the Mayorkas administration, the Biden-Mayorkas administration, is actually violating both. They're not detaining people coming in, or they're not keeping them in a third country, and they're not detaining the United States, and they're also allowing mass parole, which violates the clear intent of Congress. Is it your opinion that that this is a policy issue, and that the Biden administration has the right to clearly subvert the will of Congress?
My opinion, Congressman, is that disputes over the exercise of discretion by the Secretary are difficult. They're being resolved in the courts. And I must say that those disputes have not yet been finalized. Indeed, the only cases involving those disputes that have made it up to the Supreme Court have resulted in rulings in favor of the Secretary and of the President. Essentially, this is an ongoing legal and policy dispute. It is not, therefore, the kind of thing for which impeachment should be used.
Well, I believe that, that we're at a crossroads here, because I do believe that we, Congress, have given way too much leeway to the administrative branch, if that's the case. This is clearly the intent of Congress was people coming to the border need to either stay in another country, or they need to be detained. And it clearly was that parole was to be done on a case-by-case basis. Now, I don't believe that there's an issue of policy. It's an issue of violating the law. And that violation of the law has actually led to mass suffering in the United States. 200,000 Americans dying because of fentanyl overdose. And I disagree with my colleague on the other side that says it's a question of voluntarily stopping using drugs. Actually, a lot of these deaths are caused by people that don't even know they're taking fentanyl. They're thinking they're taking something else. and it's laced with fentanyl. And so, you know, if we're down to that, where every single time that there is that the administration decides to violate the law, that we have to impeach somebody, I guess then we need to impeach somebody. And so with that, you know, I yield my time back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I kind of agree with Mr. Godinez and some of the comments he made. Before I get into my presentation, I'd like to present a article submitted for the record titled 2023 Year in Review, Secretary Mayorkas champions department-wide efforts to save lives and prepare for the 21st century security challenges.
Without objection, so moved.
And I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. I'm glad you're here talking about those things that are important. You spoke passionately about fentanyl, the damage that's caused to our communities. I'm with you on that one. Back home on Main Street, a lot of deaths, a lot of pain because of fentanyl. My investigation of this issue, 90% of fentanyl, more like 95%, comes through our ports of entry. And 65% comes through one port of entry, the San Ysidro port of entry. And most of that, the majority, vast majority, is smuggled by American citizens and green card holders. That's why I support additional funding for our ports of entry. Technology, more personnel, more drug-sniffing dogs, more technology. And Mr. Chair, again, I want to thank you for holding this hearing, because Homeland Security is an important issue for all Americans, for this nation. So let's look at the facts here today. Let's be clear about what we're looking at today on a worldwide basis. Some of the nations that are dealing with this, what I would call worldwide refugee challenge, the United States, Europe, Germany, Italy, Greece, Colombia. Colombia's holding 3 million Venezuelan refugees right now. Costa Rica, Mexico. These are among some of the nations looking at this refugee challenge. Let's look at some of the causes of this migratory pattern. COVID-19, and Secretary Mayorkas did not bring up COVID-19. Secretary Mayorkas is also not responsible for the robberies, gang violence, extortions in Central America. And Secretary Mayorkas is also not responsible for the government collapse and violence in Haiti. He's also not responsible for the challenges, the economic collapse in Venezuela. Secretary Mayorkas is also not responsible for the human rights violations, economic collapse in Cuba. He's also not responsible for the economic collapse, human rights violations in Nicaragua, Peru, Ecuador, the invasion of Russia, of Ukraine, the economic collapse going on in China today. Secretary Mayorkas is not responsible for these things. To the contrary, he's working to manage the challenge and provide frontline officers with the resources that they need. Even Senate Republicans get it. Senate Republicans are working with Democrats right now and the White House to try to address these challenges. So in the last minute and a half that I have, I'm going to ask Professor Bowman, is Secretary Mayorkas executing the law to full extent of his abilities with the limited resources Congress has given him? Is this an impeachable offense, sir?
No, sir, it is not. And I should point out also, in addition, it's critical to note that if we could impeach cabinet officers or presidents for that matter, anytime there are legal disputes about the application of the law or their exercise of discretion, then every president and every cabinet officer would be impeachable. In the previous administration, that of Mr. Trump, there were repeated lawsuits against Mr. Trump's immigration policy, some of which he won, some of which he lost. If the mere presence of heated legal disagreements about the legitimacy of presidential immigration policy were impeachable, Mr. Trump would have been impeached for a third time. To do such a thing would be profoundly anti-constitutional and profound disruption of the constitutional separation of powers.
So, sir, are we looking essentially at political public policy debate here as opposed to an impeachable offense?
That's certainly my interpretation, Congressman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent motion here.
Do you want to do it now or wait till your turn?
I'll do it now if I could.
Okay.
I want to introduce January 10th, 2024 Washington Post article where the chairman is quoted as saying that our investigation made clear that this crisis finds its foundation in Secretary Mayorkas' decision-making, and Congressman Norman talks about needing to impeach Mayorkas because of, quote, bad judgment.
Okay. With no disconsent or disagreement, we'll admit it to the record. Now, I recognize Mr. Pfluger, the gentleman from Texas, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's sad that we're here. Sad that we're in this position. Earlier, it was said that this is not a legitimate impeachment. I guess that's something Democrats know a little bit about, and our witness just talked about the impeachment of Mr. Trump. So I disagree with that, and I take no pleasure in the significance of this effort. I've wrestled with the appropriate constitutional response to what has become a complete failure to enforce the law, to adhere to congressional directives, to secure the homeland. And the failure to secure the homeland has been so significant, so catastrophic, that Congress must use its power to provide accountability. We must be the check and the balance against such an extremely egregious breach of public trust, and that's what this is. And if not this effort, then I ask my Democrat colleagues, what effort? Where is your answer to accountability? Where is your Article 1 authorities to check the executive branch?
Will the gentleman yield to answer the question?
No, the answer from the other side simply cannot be that we're powerless. And I ask rhetorically, if not this effort, then how do we hold this failure? And you'll have your chance to wax poetic on that. Let's just go through the numbers. Fiscal 23, 27,000 pounds of fentanyl was seized. That's what was seized. That's not all that entered this country. Mr. Chairman, the Speaker of the House has put together a document, and it goes step by step for the actions the administration has taken since January 20th of 2021. President Biden terminated the national emergency at the southwest border. President Biden issued an executive order further entrenching DACA program. Biden unveiled the U.S. Citizenship Act, which would provide amnesty. The administration issued an executive order ending limitations and restrictions on immigration without certain countries associated with terrorism. Then Secretary Mayorkas delivered remarks effectively explaining the border is open for illegal immigration by stating that DHS's focus would be on processing. On and on and on. Mayorkas issued a memorandum prohibiting enforcement of immigration laws in certain areas, including schools, healthcare, and facilities. Mayorkas terminated migrant protection protocols. Mayorkas issued a memorandum that states the fact that an individual is removable alien should not be the sole basis of an enforcement action. I want to enter this with the unanimous consent into the record, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to seek unanimous consent.
So ordered.
So what is the document?
As I mentioned, the document is from the Speaker of the House, a list of actions. If we can pause the time, please, because this is administrative. This is a list of actions that the administration has taken step by step since January 20th of 2021. And it goes in order chronologically of the actions that the administration has taken that have weakened us, including those that Secretary Mayorkas has taken.
But it's created by
The gentleman is not recogned right now, okay? And
Well, then I
his
object.
time.
I object
It's
to
his
the-
time. Okay, you
No,
object.
he's trying to enter it. That's why I'm asking. I object to the entry of this document.
So
that
you
was
dissent.
created
Okay,
by-
all right. That's. We'll vote on it, I suppose. Then okay. Are you asking for a vote? Unanimous consent was just disagreed to. Are we going to vote on this?
Yes.
Okay. All right. We need to clear the witnesses, get the clerks in here, and we'll vote on it.
Stop the clock also.
That's not. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Okay. It's just okay. My apologies. It's just objected to, And there is no vote, so my misunderstanding, thank you, assuming that's what you were clarifying. Thank you, Ranking Member. The gentleman is recognized.
Okay, and I think...
And I'll make up the time.
2 minutes and 15 seconds or 2 minutes and 20 seconds when...
You're recognized.
Thank you. Earlier this year, Director Wray sat here with Secretary Mayorkas and told this committee that there were still known and suspected terrorists at large in the United States that we knew had matched the terror watch list that came into this country illegally and that we didn't know where they were. And right next to him sat Secretary Mayorkas, and I said, what is the policy of DHS when you know that somebody matches the terror watch list? This is the reason we're having this hearing, because he could not explain to this committee that DHS actually has a policy to detain those people. He couldn't explain his policy. That's why we're here, because there are people on the terror watch list. Mr. Drummond, or Attorney General Drummond, can you tell us the extent of the damages that are being done in Oklahoma as a result of the illegal immigration, the 8 million people who have entered this country illegally?
We shut down an illegal grow every day in the state of Oklahoma, where we detain and arrest upwards of dozens of people. They're refilled the next day with those who cross the border from either in a Mexican cartel or a Chinese syndicated crime organization. It is ceaseless.
Do you believe that the Department of Homeland Security, under the leadership of Secretary Mayorkas, is upholding the laws that we currently have on the books to stop illegal immigration into this country?
I think that there is a failure to enforce the laws on parole, removal requirements, detention, and the like.
I couldn't agree more. It was earlier said that we Republicans are going to the border in polo shirts and khaki pants, or something to that effect. Well, at least we're going to the border, and at least we're asking the questions, because when you talk to the Border Patrol agents, they will tell you that there are no consequences. The consequences do not exist. Deportation doesn't exist. The catch and release policies are allowing people to flood into my community of San Angelo, Texas, Midland, and Odessa. And the fentanyl deaths alone that have been catastrophic to this country, over 100,000 people, should be the sole reason that this committee comes together. I hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, when given your time, will examine the facts. The facts are that over 8 million people have come into this country illegally. The facts are that the Secretary of Homeland Security has not secured our country against terrorism, against fentanyl, against criminal gangs, against traffickers, against sex slavery, against any of it. He is complicit. In fact, he is willfully complicit, which is why he needs to be impeached. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Thanedar, the gentleman from Michigan, for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Chairman Green. And thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Professor Bowman, would you say that Secretary Mayorkas done anything that rise to the level of high crime and misdemeanor?
No, Congressman.
Now, we know our immigration system is broken for decades. There is not much work done to reform our immigration system. And Secretary Mayorkas should not bear the blame for the inherent flaws within the system he has inherited. And my appeal to my Republican colleagues here is that rather than getting bogged down in an impeachment process that seems needless and devoid of constitutional authority, let's shift our focus, working together in fixing our broken immigration system. Our broken immigration system is causing our nation a loss of billions and trillions of dollars in economic growth. When I was 24 years old, living in India, having gotten admission into a PhD program here, and I made many trips to the American embassy in Mumbai to get a student visa. And the embassy kept denying me my student visa. They denied my student visa for 4 times. And only on the 5th time I got my visa approved because the counselor who had denied my visa for the 4 times had gone to America for her vacation. I mean, there is no doubt the system is broken. We are losing. Businesses keep telling me that they can't find a qualified, skilled workforce that they need to grow the businesses. Australia and Canada has taken advantage of our broken immigration system to attract highly skilled workers that our businesses need to grow and stay on top of innovation. We know immigrants are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than their native counterparts. I just want to take this time to appeal across the aisle to let us spend our energies and our constitutional authority to solve the problems, to fix the broken immigration system that we have not dealt with for decades. And let's not blame the secretary for our broken immigration system, but let's fix it to help our economy create jobs and make things better for all. Thank you.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to witnesses for being here today. You know, I've heard a lot of the statements coming from my colleagues, and they're acting like we've come here on a whim. We're not here on a whim. This is, you know, we haven't come here lightly, this hearing today. There have been problems at the border for years, and now every state in the nation is seeing those effects negatively. I just look at my own state in New York and the costs of dealing with the crisis at the border. And we have been begging the administration to do something for years. Nothing has been done. We're not here on a whim. Something has to be done. So that's why we are here we are. If leadership can't follow the laws of the land, follow the laws of the land. It's not just policy. There's laws. There are laws on the books, and they are being ignored right now by the current administration and the current secretary. If they can't follow the laws that are on the books, we need to find someone who will. So I think we have taken the time and necessary steps to arrive here in a proper manner. It's taken a while, and our country has been a disservice because of that. It's taken so long. But we're here today, and I appreciate you all being here. And I'm going to start with Mr. Attorney General Drummond. You've described Oklahoma's challenge with the explosion of unlicensed and illicit drug manufacturing in the state following the Secretary Mayorkas becoming the leader of Homeland Security. Can you describe more about the challenges of Oklahoma law enforcement faces in confronting this illegal activity, especially for rural police and sheriff's departments who have limited resources?
Let me give you a tangible example, Representative. One recent drug bust at an illegal grow operation, our agents were processing those who were committed felonies and detained, and those that were simply being trafficked in labor and sex. And one of those was identified as an individual on an HSI detainer for illegal entry. He was supposed to be in Flushing, New York. He was supposed to have on an ankle monitor. When we contacted the field representative in HSI, they said, you know, charge him with a felony, we'll come pick him up. But he, in fact, had not committed a felony. Then we were instructed to say, please direct him to turn himself in to the nearest HSI field office. And so we did that and let him go. That happens day in and day out across Oklahoma, where we don't have the resources afforded to detain those that we know are illegally in the state, committing crimes or complicit in the committing of crimes.
You would like to, in New York, we have laws that actually direct that they automatically be released, and we see crime after crime after crime be committed by the same person. And in New York, big state like New York, you think we'd have the ability, we do have the ability to keep people in prison and stop crimes from happening. Our laws direct us not to, but at least in Oklahoma, you would like to be able to make sure that these criminals are not released back out.
Now New York has one fewer. We haven't.
Good. Another crisis, Mr. Attorney General, that has resulted from the unprecedented chaos at the southwest southern border is the explosion of fentanyl poisonings in this country. We have seen many, far too many in New York. From 2018 to 2022, Oklahoma experienced a 735% increase in fentanyl deaths, according to the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics. Oklahoma has a unique status, sitting just north of the Texas and right along major routes away from the southwest border for both drug and human smuggling. Can you talk about how the fentanyl crisis over the past few years has impacted your state?
So we, with the legalization of marijuana in Oklahoma, it's not become the drug of choice to cross the border. Fentanyl is now the drug of choice. And I take exception with the representative who said it is just to say no. It is a crisis in which we find fentanyl laced in many drugs, such that we instruct our young children to test every pill. If you think you're taking a pain pill, it's probably laced with fentanyl. And we can trace those back to the porous border through which the fentanyl product comes in concert with the Mexican cartels and the Chinese syndicated organizations.
This is for any of the attorney generals. We get a lot of unaccompanied alien children in New York. Have you witnessed in your state these children being used for purposes of sex trafficking or other forms of exploitation? Anyone can jump in and grab it.
I will jump in quickly with an example. We busted a grow in northwest Oklahoma City, and in which there were two minor young women from China that were being sex trafficked. And we've intercepted communication in mainland China where they're effectively posting jobs to come to Oklahoma, quote, as massage spa, quote, able to endure hardships, quote, good hygiene. And yet these young women are being exploited, and we don't have a remedy to take care of them.
And quickly, I know.
Missouri now ranks 4th on the list of the states with the highest rates of human trafficking. In 2021, there were 1,100 reported cases, detected cases of human trafficking in the state of Missouri, 327 victims identified.
Congressman, human trafficking has increased in my state multiple 100% since 2019. I think that answers your question.
Yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Magazine.
Thank you. Chairman, I've been listening to all of my Republican colleagues throughout this hearing, and I'm still struggling to understand what high crime they believe the Secretary has committed. I've heard that he hasn't achieved operational control, defined as not a single person crossing the border illegally. No administration has met that standard. I've heard them say that he has failed to detain everyone who is undocumented who has come across the border. No administration has. Under the Biden administration, Secretary Mayorkas has removed 3 million undocumented people from this country. So when I hear my colleagues say that deportation does not exist, I can think of 3 million people who would disagree with that. He has continued construction of a border wall that many of us question the effectiveness of, and when the Secretary and the President were asked, do you think that the wall works? They say, no, we don't think it works, but we're building it because the law requires us to do it. They're following the law. We face difficult challenges at the southern border. There is no question. Instability in other countries has driven people to come to the United States, and it has created a chaotic situation. But unfortunately, rather than working with us and the President and the Secretary to address these challenges, too many of my Republican colleagues are focused more on partisan grandstanding and campaigning, including this impeachment theater. So here's the real truth. President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas have taken steps to try to secure the borders, but House Republicans have tried to obstruct them every step of the way because they want a campaign issue more than they want to fix the problem. Here are the facts. In 2022, Democrats passed and the president signed $86 billion for enhanced border security, more personnel, more funding for ICE, additional technology. 200 House Republicans voted against that funding, including every single Republican member of this committee who was in office at the time. This year, in 2023, House Republicans passed their so-called Limit, Save, Grow Act, which would have cut the Department of Homeland Security's budget by 22%, eliminating 2,400 CBP officers. Every Republican member of the House voted for that bill, a 22% cut. The Republican Limit, Save, Grow Act, I guess, is to limit Border Patrol and grow chaos. This past year, President Biden requested $84 million in his budget to help states and cities with the costs associated with incoming migrants. House Republicans proposed cutting that funding to zero. So to the state officials who are here, who are coming from states that are having challenges with the migrant crisis, I've got bad news for you. Our Republican colleagues are trying to zero out the line item in the budget to help states and cities. I'm a former state treasurer myself, and that is deeply, deeply distressing. And of course, most recently, in October, President Biden requested $14 billion in supplemental funding for border enforcement. That would add 1,300 Border Patrol agents, 1,000 CBP officers, but House Republicans have not called a vote on this funding. And they'll say, well, there's other things in it that we don't like. You know, there's a growing pro-Putin wing in the House Republican caucus that doesn't like Ukraine funding. They don't want more asylum judges, even though that's part of how we solve the problem at the border. Fine, call a vote on the parts that you do like. The CBP agents, Border Patrol. You've been sitting on it for 3 months. If you really, truly cared about solving the problem, you would call a vote. Instead, they've been sitting on it for 3 months, then went on vacation for a month, while Secretary Mayorkas was meeting with Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats to try to come up with a border plan. And House Republicans were MIA. And I know what my colleagues are going to say. They're going to say, well, we did H.R. 2. We are trying to do something. Don't forget what's in H.R. 2. All right, H.R. 2 would require nonprofit organizations to verify the citizenship of the people they were serving, or else they would risk losing their federal funding. It would request coffee shops all across the country, small businesses, to do citizenship checks of their employees. Zero out the funding for legal assistance for minors, so that once again we'd have 5-year-olds going into court and standing in front of judges without no lawyers. And we tried to negotiate with them. We tried to put in amendments to make that bill better, but of course they wouldn't work with us. So let's not forget what's really going on here. The Secretary is trying to do his job. House Republicans have been obstructing him every step of the way and are now trying to impeach him because this is about politics for many of them. It is not about solving the problem at the border, which is what we should be doing. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Green, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to bring up that nothing spells impeachment theater, unlike the last impeachment of our former President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. That was quite a political sham impeachment. But today we're talking about a real impeachment that needs to take place. There have been over 20 occasions that Secretary Mayorkas has claimed that the border is either closed or secure, starting even back in 2021, when he is on record stating the border is secure, the border is closed. Again, the border is closed, the border is secure. He stated to Fox News' Peter Doocy, the border is closed. Then he stated again to Congressman Pfluger here on this committee. Congressman Pfluger asked him, said the border is secure. We are executing our plan, as he stated to Congressman Pfluger. Secretary Mayorkas said, I have been very clear and unequivocal in that regard. Congressman, the border is no less secure than it was previously. He also stated to Congressman Michael Guest on our committee when he was asked by Congressman Guest, do you maintain today, in light of the statements made by Chief Ortiz, that the border is secure? Secretary Mayorkas replied, Congressman, I stand by my prior assessment because indeed I define it as maximizing the resources we have to deliver the most effective results. His results have been quite effective. Here are some of Secretary Mayorkas's effective results. Approximately 10 million illegal border crossers from over 160 countries have invaded the United States since President Biden took office and Secretary Mayorkas started his job. This is a number combined with over 8 million encounters and over 1.8 million gotaways. In September 2023, over 341,000 illegal border crossers invaded our country, surpassing all national records. Secretary Mayorkas is bringing the results. In fiscal year 2023, there were over 3 million illegals who invaded the border, the highest number of yearly illegal alien encounters in U.S. history. That far surpasses those that were supposedly deported. There have been approximately 73,000 special interest aliens arrested at our border. Those are the ones that we know of, ladies and gentlemen. There's over 1.8 million gotaways, and we have no idea how many in that 1.8 million or more are terrorists, are from terrorist nations. We don't know where they are, what they're doing, and what their plans are for the United States of America, including the states that you're working very hard to protect. These are some impressive results. Most impressive for American taxpayers is the total federal expenditures, and this is just in 2023, stands at $66,449,136,000. But let's talk about total state and local expenditures. Stands at $115,608,730,000. The total national expenditures for border crossers for 2023 stands at $182,057,865,000. That is an unbelievable expense for the American people and the American taxpayers. And what are the results from Secretary Mayorkas's job performance? He's violated the Secure Fence Act of 2006 by not maintaining operational control of our border. He's violated the Immigration and Nationality Act. He has violated the INI by implementing catch and release policies when federal law specifically mandates the detention and removal of inadmissible aliens. He's violated the INI. He's violated the guarantee clause set forth in Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, which requires the federal government to protect states against invasion. And I'd like to just finish with asking each one of you, in your position and your experience and the problems that each of you are dealing with, do you believe that Secretary Mayorkas's actions and refusal to enforce the laws warrant impeachment?
Absolutely, Congresswoman.
He has failed to perform and is culpably inefficient, yes.
The Secretary is acting in violation of the law and constitutional order.
Thank you very much. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Ms. Ramirez from Illinois for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. After a year in this room, after more than 15 hearings and approximately 45 hours of talking and talking and talking about the border, we come back to committee not to address 30 years of failed border policy and political inaction that's created a humanitarian crisis in our borders, but to pursue a baseless impeachment. Today marks the 16th wasted hearing on the border. Mr. Bowman, give me a yes or no. Based on your knowledge and expertise on impeachments, do you agree that historically impeachments have been an important tool to ensure accountability in our democratic institutions? Yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you. And Mr. Bowman, if you could be concise with just one sentence, are you aware of any federal offense Secretary Mayorkas has committed that could amount to an impeachable offense?
No.
Thank you. And for the record, because I think you've had to answer this a couple times, yes or no, in your expert opinion, is there a legitimate basis for this impeachment?
No.
And in your opinion, in today's hearing, is this an effective use of committee resources, yes or no?
I don't know, that's a question I'm an expert in answering. I think that's a question for the committee.
Well, let me answer that. I believe it is not the right use of our time here, because I think that we should be here identifying ways to address solutions. So this impeachment proceedings demonstrate that some of my Republicans, seriously, they're willing to take impeachment, an important tool for accountability, and make a mockery of it for political gain. This is how I know that they're not taking the humanitarian crisis within our borders seriously, because impeachment will not make our borders any safer for our communities or for asylum seekers. And it will not address the conditions across Latin America that motivate families to migrate across jungles and deserts to our southern border. So if they were serious, they would be taking up any of the topics on this list of 16 possible policy solutions and 16 legislative actions that require us, Congress people, to advance, including today, we've wasted 16 hearings on political theater that could have been better served considering policies on 16 actions right here behind me. Let me read them for the record. We could be expanding work permits. We could be increasing border personnel to expand assistance to new arrivals. We could be modernizing legal pathways to citizenship. We can be granting immigration parole instead of fighting it. We could be addressing and preparing for climate migration. We could be investing in economic development of Latin American communities. We can end the Monroe Doctrine. We can allocate resettlement funding for displaced populations. We can lift and reform time-based immigration bars. We can modernize definitions, standards in our antiquated system. We can establish humanitarian standards. We can improve upon adjudicatory processing capacity. We can increase personnel to reduce USCIS backlogs. We can implement federal coordination of resettlement to interior cities. Let me take a breath. Now let me go to the 15th. We can strengthen democracy and combat corruption in Latin America. We can pass H.R. 16, the American Dream and Promise Act. And because fentanyl is, in fact, an issue in this country, let me add a 17th one. Since if we wanted to work, we can actually get things done. We could actually fund technological resources to prevent fentanyl from being smuggled through our ports of entry by U.S. Americans. So let me say to you, as a proud daughter of immigrants, the wife of a dreamer, and the representative of Illinois 3, I'm here to get things done. We have to get serious about addressing every policy opportunity listed behind me today. We could start by expediting work permits, because let's just be honest. To me, Congress, this institution, this chamber represents a sacred responsibility to come together to realize the solutions and problems impacting our constituents. And let me tell you, the persecution of immigrants and Secretary Mayorkas is not going to change the price of milk in your district. It's not going to address the shrinking tax base in your district. And it's not going to fill the vacant positions of industries in your local businesses. Action will. Action will address the historic labor shortage. It will increase our revenue through taxes. It will reduce supply and distribution chain challenges, and it will grow our GDP by $1.7 trillion over the next decade. So if we are serious to address this border issue, then let's actually get to do the work that addresses border policy. Because policy in action speaks louder than the 16 hearings and the 48 hours of talk and sound bites and photo ops at the border. I have been to the border. My mother crossed it. I was there with her. I am serious about the work we can do here. Are you? Thank you, Chairman, and with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize the Vice Chair of the committee, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Guest, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I begin my question, I have something I'd like to submit for the record. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record a post from January 15, 2019, titled "The Case for Impeachment of Donald Trump, Part 3." written by Mr. Bowman, one of our witnesses today, in which he takes a very highly, a view of impeachment in which he says that then President Donald Trump could be impeached over foreign policy differences. And I quote from that article, it said, "Surely we can impeach a president for needless shattering a basket of good treaties and entire intricate web of foreign relations they support. Consider Mr. Trump's rolling destruction of America's foreign policy." And goes on to say there's powerful evidence that the framers included conducts damaging to the U.S. policy, a category of impeachable behavior. I think that contradicts the testimony that we've heard here today, Mr. Chairman, from Mr. Bowman, and so I would like to submit this article for the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To our witnesses, thank you for being here today. We see the numbers on the southwest border continue to grow exponentially each and every day. As our attorney generals know, you are more aware of these numbers than we are because you deal with the after effects. Those 300,000 that came across the border just last month, many of those will end up in your communities. Your testimonies, as I've read them, says that your communities, your states, your cities, that you'll be responsible for housing, for feeding, for educating, for health care. You talk about the strain that this is going to be placing on the criminal justice system. And then you also talk about the total lack of response from our federal government. And so first I want to apologize to you that you are not getting the help that you need from the federal government. And the help that you need is not us sending you money after these immigrants have come into your community. The help that you need is us stopping the immigrants from coming across the border. What we saw is we need policies similar to what we saw under the previous administration, where we were able to stop immigrants from coming across the border. The last two witnesses on the other side try to place blame on this on the Republican Party, that we need to be doing more. And I know that our attorney generals know, and I hope those watching on television know, that this Republican Party has done our part. We have passed H.R. 2, the most comprehensive immigration package that has been made through at least the House of Representatives in decades, would substantially overhaul the crisis that we see. In addition to that, we passed our House Appropriations Bill dealing with Homeland Security. In that House Appropriations Bill, we added additional Border Patrol agents. We added merit pay bonuses for those agents who had been there for a while. We put money in the budget for technology. And we even said, hey, we got to get back to building the wall. Something that I think many of us will agree has to be a part of that comprehensive package. And so for my friends across the aisle who want to place the blame on Republicans that we haven't done anything, look at our bills that are sitting over there on Chuck Schumer's desk that he's not taking up in the Senate. As they continue to sit there, as they continue to fiddle, Rome burns. And you are having to deal with the aftermath of that. And so I have a question for you, and Marjorie Taylor Greene talked a little bit about this. We've repeatedly had the secretary here. He's come here time and time and time again. And every time that he's been asked a question by me and my colleagues, he has repeatedly said that our southwest border is secure. Regardless of the facts and figures and anything that statistically you show him where that is not the case, that is what he continues to hang his hat on, that this border is secure and that there is no crisis. Well, we know there's a crisis because you see it. And so my question here in the last just 30 seconds that I have, and I'm going to ask all four of our witnesses a very simple yes or no question. Do you believe that there is a crisis at the southern border, and is the border secure? So I guess I'm going to ask each of you two questions. Is the border secure? We'll start there. And the second one is, do you believe that there's a crisis? Attorney General Knudsen, we'll begin with you.
Congressman, the southern border is absolutely not secure, and this is far beyond a crisis at this point.
Similarly, it is not secure, and we have a crisis.
General Bailey?
The border is not secure in the crisis of historically epic proportion.
And Mr. Bowman?
As I said at the outset, I'm not an expert on immigration policy. I don't have any opinion on this question.
What's your personal opinion?
My personal opinion is that there is, as there has been for decades, and indeed probably a century and a half in this country, a lot of controversy about immigration policy. There's controversy about the way in which immigration policy is being administered at the southern border. I think at the moment we seem to have more problems in that area than we've had in some past eras. Yes.
Thank you for your very politically correct answer. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Ivey of Maryland for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you all for coming today. Just briefly, I wanted to respond to the comment about legislation sitting on Senator Schumer's desk. You know, with respect to H.R. 2, I think it was clear before it was passed, frankly, as it came through the committee here. Democrats offered amendments, all of which were rejected. Republicans put in poison pill language, especially with respect to not only abortion on some of these bills, but cutting off federal funding to agencies and, you know, social support groups like Red Cross, Catholic Church, and the like. So the fact that you sent it over there knowing it was DOA, I think is not much to praise for the effort. But more importantly, although Speaker Johnson sent all of us home 3 weeks early, the Senate stayed, and the Democrats and Republicans were actually working on bipartisan legislation to try and address the border crisis, working with the White House and, yes, Secretary Mayorkas to try and find an agreement. Meanwhile, the House Republicans, instead of working with that group and joining in those negotiations, did a road trip to Texas for a photo op opportunity to talk about the issues at the border. So if we want to get serious about it, oh, and by the way, President Biden sent supplemental legislation, man, I think it was in September for additional funding. No response from the Republican colleagues. So if you can, so, you know, part of that's one of the minor things addressed in this article behind me, worst Congress ever, that goes to the ineffectiveness of this Congress under the House Republican leadership to get anything done that's critical. We've probably gone through the issues of pending legislation, Israel, Ukraine, FISA, all the things that haven't got done that need to get done. The border's another one. I hope my Republican colleagues will get busy on that. With respect to the actual issue of impeachment from a legal standpoint, I went through the testimony that the generals provided. I only saw 2 paragraphs in all 3 of your testimony with respect to that, and none of it actually spoke to the language in the Constitution with respect to treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors. And I thought that was interesting. You know, Professor Turley, who is not necessarily my favorite, but Republicans seem to like him. He testifies a lot. In fact, at the opening hearing for the impeachment hearings against Joseph Biden, the Oversight Committee leadership called 3 experts to testify. Turley was one of the 3. And one of the things Turley said, like he's saying here, is that there's no basis for impeachment. His taking this position with respect to Secretary Mayorkas. And, you know, the fact that none of the witnesses that have been called today by the Republicans actually have that kind of experience with respect to impeachment and expertise, and I thought was interesting. I'll add this too. You can put it down. We want to add to the record a couple of documents. One is the Turley letter, which I'll offer in a moment. But the second is a letter, an op-ed that was written by Joshua Matz and Norm Eisen, who are former members of the House Judiciary Committee who've actually worked on impeachment hearings before. And they talked about the absence of evidence to support impeachment here. And a couple of respects that I think are important that we go through. One is the issue of maladministration. So the framers, when they put the provision, and they went through different iterations of it, but they ended up with the language they've got, but excluded a term like maladministration so that we wouldn't have impeachment hearings for policy differences. Because, and this is James Madison, if we did that, the Senate could be picking and choosing and throwing out people. Just on policy disagreements, we should leave that to the president. The president gets to make a selection, pick his cabinet or her cabinet, hopefully one day, and make the decisions on who should be ruling there. The issue here, and that's pointed out in the Eisen letter and with respect to the group of professors led by Lawrence Tribe and others who point this out, this is just a maladministration dispute. My colleagues over here are talking about the borders run amok and all of that, and I hear that point, but that's just a policy difference. In the testimony that was given, points about bribery, treason, crime, high crimes and misdemeanors don't seem to have been made. There's no legal violation, there's no criminal act, there's no basis that the framers were looking for to remove a cabinet member from office. That's a very serious step. And by the way, I got a printout of all of the impeachment legislation that my colleagues have put together. I think Ms. Taylor Greene alone just has 8 impeachment resolutions in this Congress, 8. 3, I think, against Secretary Mayorkas. So if we're going to be serious about this, let's try and get to the issues with respect to the actual legal piece. And I apologize, Mr. Chairman, but I'll conclude there. And I look forward to actually having a debate and experts who can speak to this from expertise or scholarship on the issue of the standard for impeachment.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lalota, for his 5 minutes of questions.
More than any other cabinet secretary in America's history, Secretary Mayorkas is failing America. But don't take my word for it. 68% of Americans disapprove of the Biden administration's handling of the southern border. 68%. 75% of Americans see the border situation as either a crisis or a serious problem. 75%. So while our country is divided on so many policy issues, there is overwhelming support from across America for Secretary Mayorkas to finally secure our southern border. 68% and 75%. Yet, the administration and my colleagues from the other side of the aisle won't change their border policies. Secretary Mayorkas won't change his policies or approach. The administration won't reinstate Remain in Mexico, and blue cities won't repeal their sanctuary city policies. Secretary Mayorkas won't change his border policies, all while tens of thousands of Americans are dying from the fentanyl being smuggled across his open border. Secretary Mayorkas won't and can't properly vet the tens of thousands of migrants he is paroling into our country from nations with whom America is adversarial. So here we are. So what do we in this Congress do when somewhere around 75% of our constituents, and by the way, from blue districts and red districts and purple districts, want accountability? 75%. What do we do when tens of thousands of Americans are dying? What do we do when potentially hundreds of terrorist sleeper cells are being hatched every day inside of America's borders? What do we do? Do we do nothing? Do we wrap ourselves in some sort of bureaucracy and find some sort of legal reasoning not to do anything? Or do we act? And let me state quite clearly that I do not take impeachment lightly. Impeachment is meant for the most serious, grave circumstances when there is a true failure and willful dereliction of duty has occurred. And in this case, Secretary Mayorkas has committed 3 specific violations which warrant impeachment. He has neglected his duty to secure our border. He has abused his power to exercise proper discretion over America's immigration process. And Secretary Mayorkas has breached America's public trust. And no matter what the secretary or the president say, the numbers speak for themselves. Since President Biden has been in office, there have been 4.5 million migrant encounters at the southwest border, in addition to over 1.2 million gotaways who evaded U.S. Border Patrol agents in the last 2 years. Those numbers are larger than the population of Los Angeles, the second largest city in the United States. And let me be abundantly clear, this is not the failure of the hardworking men and women who are out there every day in the front line of this crisis. This is a failure of leadership at the highest levels, right up to Secretary Mayorkas and President Biden. And while there are at least 3 criteria which merit Secretary Mayorkas' impeachment and removal, today I would like to focus on just one of them: Secretary Mayorkas neglecting his duty to secure the border. Attorney General Knudsen, good to be with you here today, sir. And thanks for your hard work keeping your residents in Montana safe. In October, sir, you joined a coalition of 27 state attorneys general in a petition urging Secretary Mayorkas to end his policy of mass catch and release. And I was hoping that you could define, sir, for Americans who may be watching from home today and maybe not so familiar with this topic, what catch and release means, sir.
Thank you, Congressman. I can. So generally speaking, Congressman, under 8 U.S.C. 1225, the law is very clear. The Secretary has a duty to detain every single alien that enters the country. Period. Hard stop. Shall be detained. There is one exception. There's a case-by-case exception listed under Section 1182, which allows on a case-by-case individual temporary basis for either humanitarian or for public justice reasons, an exception. Under Secretary Mayorkas' direction, that basically has been turned into not a case-by-case analysis, but rather a mass catch and release, where those individuals are no longer given an individual investigation, an individual notice to appear in front of a judge. They were given a notice to report. That appears nowhere in the Federal Register, that appears nowhere in federal law, and was basically used as a mass catch and release program. So that's what we're talking about.
So would you agree that the mass catch and release that is not done on a case-by-case basis is inconsistent with the laws passed by Congress and signed into law by both, by presidents of both parties?
Absolutely, Congressman. There is no legal authority anywhere in federal code for mass release of immigrants into this country.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Menendez, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm frustrated that Republicans on this committee have chosen to engage in this political exercise and are proceeding to willfully misinterpret the U.S. Constitution and every precedent from the past 250 years by impeaching Secretary Mayorkas. Last week, one of our Republican colleagues said he was not likely to support any compromised border bill because, quote, I'm not willing to do too damn much right now to help a Democrat and to help Joe Biden's approval rating. I will not help the Democrats try to improve this man's dismal approval ratings. I'm not going to do it. Why would I, end quote. Why would he? Because we need to work together to address the critical issues that our committee has jurisdiction over. Because we owe it to our constituents and our communities to meet this moment. But that's not what this hearing is about. Because when you talk about approval ratings and not wanting to help Democrats, not wanting to help this administration, not wanting to help our president, you undermine the seriousness of what is being discussed today. And you make clear what this has always been, political pursuit. Speaking of politics, I have a few yes or no questions for the 3 attorney generals here today. You are all elected officials, is that correct?
Yes.
I was appointed to my office subject to election by the people.
Understood. And you are all Republicans, is that correct?
Yes.
And lastly, in 2016 and 2020, President Trump won in the states that you serve as Attorney General of?
Yes.
Yes.
So it's fair to conclude that it's politically beneficial for you to be supportive of the former president and his policies and oppose President Biden's policies, as is the case for all of our Republican colleagues here on this committee. But constitutional law is clear on this point. Policy, political differences are not appropriate grounds for impeachment. Mr. Bowman, is that correct? Yes or no?
It is.
Thank you. House Republicans have said they will not support, quote, another dime, end quote, for DHS until the enactment of H.R. 2, their extreme anti-immigrant border bill that would severely restrict our legal immigration system, a bill that would endanger migrant lives by denying asylum seekers their legal right to seek protection in the United States, and reinstating dangerous policies that force migrants to remain in unsafe conditions, such as remain in Mexico. But Republicans know that H.R. 2 is so cruel and unworkable that it will never become law. But that's what they use to say we're doing something here. That's what we're doing on this committee in this Congress. Instead, Republicans could support President Biden's request for funding for more CBP officers and fentanyl detection technology to increase CBP's capacity to identify bad actors and drugs at our southern border. But no, they won't support this funding or any solution that would help this administration carry out border security efforts, because it would weaken their political talking points. That's been their strategy this entire administration. In this committee, we have real opportunities to work on substantive issues together across the aisle. Instead, my Republican colleagues are distorting this committee and its mandate to safeguard our nation's homeland security into a vehicle for false narratives about migrants and the border. Professor Bowman, let me ask you a question. Is it appropriate to impeach Secretary Mayorkas because of policy disagreements?
No.
Is it appropriate to impeach Secretary Mayorkas because Republicans refuse to properly fund DHS and allow him to do his job?
Well, I don't want to characterize the actions of the Republicans, but certainly you don't impeach me.
We'll take your first part of the answer.
Politics.
Professor Bowman, is it appropriate to impeach Secretary Mayorkas because Republicans would rather narrate a crisis to score political points than work with the administration to strengthen the security of our border?
It's certainly not impeachment. It's certainly not appropriate to impeach a cabinet officer over political or policy disagreements.
I agree. Attorney General Drummond, thank you for your testimony, your written testimony. I went through it. I appreciate it. This day and age, we deal a lot with sourcing and citations. I noticed there was a single source in yours, and it was to the Federation for American Immigration Reform. Are you aware that the Southern Poverty Law Center has designated the Federation for American Immigration Reform as a hate group whose leaders have ties to white nationalists?
I'm not.
Yeah, completely understandable. I would just let you know that a lot of the sources that have been used in all this investigative materials and reports that have been put forth by the majority have relied on far-right, anti-immigrant think tanks and groups that are not aligned with what I believe our country's morals and values are. And that's a problem with a lot of the reports that this hearing, that this impeachment process and procedure has been based on. And that's where this all falls apart for me. I really wish we were engaging in a thoughtful exercise. I really wish we were trying to solve some of the challenges that we're facing, but that's not what today is about. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields.
Yes. Mr. Goldman referenced two articles, Turley and Eisen, and the clerk has already collected them, but it was just a unanimous consent to include them in the record. Actually, Mr. Ivey.
Yeah, I think I was watching back there. I saw it was Mr. Ivey. So yeah, so ordered. And
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today and providing this important testimony. Let's be clear about this. The Biden administration and Secretary Mayorkas did not inherit the crisis at the border. They created it. Ignoring the desperate pleas from affected and scared families nationwide, Secretary Mayorkas has intentionally disregarded the law, leaving the border open to an endless stream of migrant, drug, and cartel members. My time as a sheriff, and if I was neglecting my duties to enforce the law, it would have cost me my job. The Secretary should be held to the same standard. Mr. Drummond, your story about the illegal Chinese national who executed the 3 men, that's really stuck with me. The reports are clear that terrorist organizations are exploiting the vulnerability of our nation's border. It is simply irresponsible that Secretary Mayorkas continues to ignore the significant threat to our national security. Do you believe Secretary Mayorkas' actions have emboldened terrorists around the world? And is it fair to say he has intentionally ignoring our nation's current laws that should make it harder to enter our country illegally?
I think that it is indisputable that we have terrorist organizations invading my state. We've identified numerous gangs, numerous syndicated crime organizations, and they only grow on a daily basis.
Mr. Knudsen and Mr. Bailey, would you care to comment on this as well?
I would point out that the 2 lawsuits that we have pending right now dealing with the parole process, the abuse of the parole process, Secretary Mayorkas' violation of the plain text of the statute as it relates to parole, and his promulgation of the circumvention rule have been described as engaging in a child trafficking delivery service. So it's not just that he's emboldening the enemies of the United States, he's actually actively participating in some of the harms by using support networks to allow for illegal immigration that used to be considered unlawful through the stroke of his pen without congressional authority.
Congressman, I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I can tell you the increased gang activity in my state. I can tell you the increase in firearm crime in my state, increase in officer-involved shootings. We can tie this all directly to the cartel drug problems that is flooding my state. We've seen fentanyl seizures in my state rise by some measurements up from 11,000% in my state just since 2019. Those are numbers that we were not seeing prior to this administration change. I think that's pretty staggering.
Thank you. Mr. Drummond, in your state and many others, we've had taken steps to safeguard our communities because we cannot rely on this administration to protect us. For example, Mississippi, my home state, has set up a fentanyl strike force to tackle the influx of drugs. I noticed that the state of Oklahoma has also formed a similar task force. Can you elaborate on some of the findings of that task force?
Yes, we have created an organized crime task force with the explicit purpose of coordinating with other state agencies to tackle this endemic of illegal immigration in the state of Oklahoma and the drugs and the detriment that they drag into the state. And it's come at an extremely high cost for the state. We've allocated an additional $3 million for my office just to staff that. And the toll on human, it's just remarkable.
Are there any recommendations, the task force findings, that you could recommend to the Congress to consider implementing on a federal level?
It would be very helpful if the terrorism category, if cartels would be listed as foreign terrorist organizations. Right now, they fall outside that immigration inadmissibility definition, and if they were designated as such, it would give us strength in deportation.
Also, in your testimony, you pointed out that smaller law enforcement departments are outmanned, outgunned, and ill-equipped to address the threats coming across our border, particularly the threats from the Mexican and Chinese drug syndicates. I can sympathize with this and certainly understand the stress that is placed on our rural law enforcement officers when dealing with such a rise in crime. As departments are forced and stretch their resources addressing pressing issues, can you talk a little bit about the ripple effects and the gaps it leaves in our critical areas of law enforcement and safety for our communities?
It has truly taken the attention of all law enforcement in the state of Oklahoma toward this issue, where we have a shell owner buying a piece of property, pushing up berms of dirt with bulldozers, manning those with semi-automatic weapons at the top. Very intimidating for our local law enforcement. They're outgunned, outmanned, and our resources are stretched in the state.
Thank you, Mr. Drummond, and the other witnesses as well for your input today. Once again, the committee has shown that Secretary Mayorkas bears direct responsibility for the chaos at the border. I will not tolerate the overlooking of real threats that are jeopardizing innocent lives. His failures demand swift accountability. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. You know, often I see my colleagues across the aisle brandishing the Constitution like a sword. You love to quote it, you love to cite it, you love to talk about what the Founding Fathers intended, that original intent, but it's kind of like Shakespeare and the Bible. Those who talk about it the most have seldom read it and really may not understand what's in there. You know, if you talk about original intent, you're saying what the Founding Fathers intended. Now, that's a smaller country, smaller population, smaller budget. We had no AI, we had no drones. How do we know what they intended? Well, often we don't, but in this case, we know exactly what they intended. All you have to do is look at some of the notes from the Convention of the Constitution by Madison, who did not want to include the maladministration because it was too broad and policy-oriented. Look at Federalist Papers 65 by Hamilton, a conservative at the time, who did not want to include this broader interpretation of impeachment. Now, you've also heard Mr. Bowman's arguments, a respected scholar who you have demeaned his expertise by insinuating, oh, he's just a Democratic witness. But he is not alone in this position. Mr. Turley's letter was mentioned. There is an article in The Hill about another letter from legal scholars. This is a group of legal scholars who wrote a letter to our chairman and the leadership of the House, Speaker Johnson, that says their proposed grounds for impeaching Mayorkas are the stuff of ordinary policy disagreement in the field of immigration enforcement. They go on to say that this is inappropriate. They admit they have varying views on the wisdom and success of Mayorkas' work on the immigration policy, but they say you cannot have impeachment based on this policy. It is a, I quote, stark departure from the Constitution. Now, these legal scholars included in this letter are Donald Ayer, who served as U.S. Deputy Attorney General under George H.W. Bush, Stuart Gerson, who served as acting U.S. Attorney General during Clinton and also served in the Justice Department under Bush. You have Mr. Turley also included in this. There's even a quote by Dershowitz who says that this is inappropriate use of impeachment. So Mr. Bowman, with his expertise, does not stand alone in condemning this use of impeachment for political reasons. Now, I look at this resolution that we're supposed to be considering that was offered by Ms. Taylor Greene, and aside from the fact that it's got some punctuation and grammatical errors, it lists some ways that the Secretary has been effective in the amount of fentanyl that has been seized at the border, the number of people who were caught on the terrorist watch list before they came into the country. Those are all evidence that he is carrying out his duty. What I don't see anywhere in this resolution, nor have I heard from any of my colleagues, nor any of our attorneys general, is how impeaching the Secretary is going to solve all these problems. How's it going to get rid of these illegal grow places in Oklahoma? How's it going to get rid of all the terrorists who are coming into Missouri? How is it going to solve the fentanyl problem in these other, whatever other state, Montana, because we've gotten rid of Mr. Mayorkas. If anybody can add that and tell us how getting rid of him is going to make a difference, I'd like to hear it. We hear over in the Senate, Mr. Lankford, Senator Lankford, who is a Republican, saying, well, you can just switch one secretary for another. It's not going to make any difference. So perhaps we could talk about how getting rid of Mr. Mayorkas through this impeachment process is going to make a difference. I hear nothing.
Did you want, does the gentlelady yield?
No, I'm not going to.
Okay, all right.
So since I gave you,
I'd gladly answer the question.
I gave you an opportunity. I gave you an, okay, I'll yield.
Okay, all right. Well, in my previous testimony, I've shared that the policies that he's implemented has allowed the cartels, and actually Merrick Garland agreed with this, that they're flooding the crossing sites, tying up the Border Patrol, causing them to concentrate, and then the fentanyl and the other things are coming across the border outside. Now, I get the argument that's often made about what's captured is mostly captured at the crossing site.
You're not answering, you take my time back.
Okay, all right.
Mr. Chairman, you're not answering my question, how getting rid of Mayorkas is going to solve these problems. What you really want to do is get rid of President Biden. You want to get rid of President Biden, and then perhaps you can put your own secretary in there that will come up with different policy. But just impeaching Mayorkas, we'll have another appointment of another secretary who follows the policy of the administration, and you won't like that either. So thank you, Mr. Bowman, for your expertise, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. D'Esposito, for his 5 minutes question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's clear that the disapproval of the policies of Joe Biden and Secretary Mayorkas are not just specific to Republicans or conservatives. The numbers that were shared by my good friend from New York, Mr. Lalotta, 75% of people have said that the border is the biggest issue facing this country. You talk about numbers. Fiscal year 21, since fiscal year 21, 8,542,000 people have come across our borders. Over 3 million in fiscal year 23. In November, 308,000 and change, 242,000 at our southern border. 312 terrorists who have come across on our terror watch list in fiscal year 21. 1.8 million gotaways that we know about, and many more that we don't. It's cost cities and states throughout this country $451 billion with a B. There's been over 70,000 Americans killed by fentanyl that have come across from cartels. We've been asked the question, is this about policy or is this about the things that Mayorkas has committed? Well, if you ask me, all those numbers is a complete betrayal to this country. We talk, and has been mentioned by colleagues, that again, this is political theater. This is Republicans, conservatives, using the border as a narrative as we go towards an election. But this isn't a narrative. It's not one created by the Republicans, and I'll take us back to my home state of New York, where you have Democrats. Our governor has said flat out, there's no room left in New York. There's no room at the inn. Don't send migrants here anymore. We've heard a Democrat city mayor, Mayor Adams, who I disagree with virtually everything about, but this I actually agree with. He has said that the migrant issue in New York City will destroy New York. So this doesn't seem like it's political theater. It doesn't seem like it's a narrative that's been created by Republicans and conservatives, because you now have Democrats in these blue states and sanctuary states and cities who agree with us. Just last night, we had children told in New York City that they can no longer attend school in person. They have to do it virtually because their school is now being used to house migrants. Now just think about that for a second. We want to talk about the failed policies. This isn't just a policy. This is intent. Mayorkas has intentionally betrayed this country. People are claiming that they want to come here for a better way of life, for democracy, for a chance at that American dream, for a better education. And yet children who came here correctly, children who were born here, last night were told that they cannot go to school because there's no room for them because it's being used by migrants. That's the height of hypocrisy. And if you ask me, it is a betrayal of this country. Mr. Gettner-Drummond, in your testimony, you talked about how smaller law enforcement agencies feel that they are ill-equipped to handle the threats stemming from the border crisis. Can you talk about how the border crisis impacts the resources of smaller police agencies and what the officers in those departments are feeling?
Well, certainly it strains the resources, and it is wildly intimidating to our local law enforcement, where they have maybe a police force of 3 or 4 in a community of 2,000, and yet they have 4 or 5 illegal grows that are populated by illegal immigrants, Mexican cartel members, Chinese syndicated crime organization members, with semi-assault, semi-automatic rifles abundant, and they are unwilling to go in.
And I know the answer to this, but I want to ask it so it's on the record, because I think it's another clear indicator of Mayorkas' failure of his oath and the fact that he's betrayed this country. Do you know, or have you experienced law enforcement agencies, to your knowledge, that have said that they have lacked notification and information and intelligence sharing from federal partners when it comes to migrants?
I would say the cooperation with our federal agencies is high in Oklahoma. We have an excellent working relationship. So I commend the federal agencies working with Oklahoma. I think it goes at a higher level, and that's the implementation of the laws of the United States.
Right. Mr. Knudsen, do you want to comment on that?
I completely agree with my colleague here. The level of cooperation with federal DEA, with our U.S. Attorney's Office in Montana has been very, very high and very excellent. Customs and Border Patrol, I might add, we're a northern tier state. We work with them a lot. But certainly the message has come down from Secretary Mayorkas and from on high that we're going to just flagrantly ignore portions of federal law.
And that is really the point that I was trying to make. He has made it very clear that he wants to ignore federal law. There are, you're lucky in your states to have great communications, but there has been, and there have been testimony in this very committee of people who led local law enforcement agencies who have said, I mean, take for example, the airport and JFK where they were housing migrants, where there was zero communications between law enforcement agencies because they just didn't want to share the information. With that, my time's expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Goldman, the gentleman from New York, for his 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I find it really difficult to sit here listening to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle slander personally a cabinet secretary who has committed much of his life to this government and our public service. He was a U.S. attorney. He's worked multiple stints in the Department of Homeland Security. And you're certainly welcome to disagree with how he executes his job. You're welcome to criticize him. You're welcome to make the case to the American people as to why Secretary Mayorkas, in executing President Joe Biden's immigration policy, should be removed from office at the ballot box. But to come in here over and over and over again and to personally attack and slander without any evidence a cabinet secretary who has committed so much of his life to this country, who himself comes from a Cuban family escaping difficult circumstances in his country, who is an immigrant family himself. You should be ashamed of yourself. It's enough. You want to talk policy? Let's talk policy. I agree we have problems at the border. Let's talk about how we can solve them. But instead of actually going over to the Senate, this committee, which has the Committee of Jurisdiction over border policy that is being negotiated right now by a bipartisan group in the Senate with Secretary Mayorkas, instead of actually engaging in those substantive negotiations to reach some sort of a bipartisan agreement to address the problems, we are sitting here with a charade of a sham impeachment hearing with expert impeachment witnesses who are Republican officials, political officials suing the Department of Homeland Security. Another hearing. It's the same hearing we've had 10, 12 times. Same pig, different lipstick, because we're now going to call it an impeachment hearing. So who do we have here? And I am sure all three of you are excellent attorneys general. But I have never heard your names mentioned in the category of Mr. Bowman, who is a legal expert on impeachment. And as far as I can tell, none of your states actually are on the border. So I don't understand why we are sitting here in a, quote, impeachment hearing with three attorneys general from different states who are Republican officials and have absolutely no expertise on impeachment. The reason is because the last time the Republicans did that and they brought in their so-called experts on impeachment for the first and only oversight public hearing, they were embarrassed because their own experts acknowledged that there is insufficient evidence to impeach President Biden. So who do we have here? We have attorneys general who are suing Secretary Mayorkas and the government to stop him from implementing his policy to address the issues at the border. That's right. So one rule that the department has implemented was the asylum processing rule, which would allow asylum officers rather than immigration courts to decide asylum applications for those placed in expedited removal to significantly expedite the process. That might reduce the backlog. That might create a disincentive to come. That's something that Secretary Mayorkas did to address the border. No, you sued him to stop him from doing that. How about the circumvention rule? Well, that is the circumvention, excuse me. How about the asylum circumvention rule, which says that you have to either appear at a port of entry or have first sought asylum from a neighboring country? That would reduce the people who could apply for asylum. No, you sued them. You sued them to stop them from doing that. And how about trying to address the parole decisions to allow some people to come in and be able to actually have work authorizations so that they are not just sitting on the dole? No, you sued them. So this is what we have. We have Republicans suing Secretary Mayorkas to stop him from implementing his policy to address the issues of the border. And now we're going to impeach him because you say he's not addressing the issues at the border. Which do you want? I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Lee for the gentlelady from Florida for 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Much has been said today by our colleagues across the aisle about this hearing and the purposes for it. It's been called a waste of time. It's been called a charade. It's been suggested that it's repetitive or unnecessary. To suggest that this hearing is any of those things, or to suggest that this hearing is tantamount to nothing more than a discussion of policy differences, is to fundamentally deny the seriousness, the scope, the scale of the catastrophe at our southern border, and the testimony of these witnesses who are here today and every witness that has come before them to testify in front of this committee about the seriousness of this crisis. We are here today because Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas has intentionally gone around and subverted the immigration laws of the United States of America. We are here today because Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas has repeatedly defied orders from courts directing him to cease and desist certain policies, which he continues to utilize. We are here today because the Department of Homeland Security has defied inquiries from Congress trying to get to the bottom of the scope and the scale of this crisis. And we are here today because Secretary Mayorkas has defied congressional directives related to spending, congressional directives as to how money was supposed to be spent. We are here because there is an unchecked flood of illegal immigration at our southern border that is destroying not just border communities, but communities around our country. Today alone, we have heard extraordinary and compelling testimony about the utter lawlessness that is occurring in this administration. Attorney General Knudsen shared with us that he perceives a refusal to faithfully execute the laws of the United States and shared stories from his state about human trafficking and fentanyl trafficking and the devastation that has occurred because of our wide open southern border. Attorney General Drummond commented on the failure to enforce our laws and how that has affected his state. He also shared the extraordinary cost that it incurs at his state because we are not enforcing our laws in our border. And Attorney General Bailey touched on the issue of parole, which has become an absolute farce and workaround for following our laws. He's said perverting the plain text of the law. And indeed, that's exactly what is happening. In my state, Florida, we too have been forced to sue the Department of Homeland Security to attempt to achieve any semblance of lawful behavior and policy. United States District Court Judge Kent Wetherall, in an order directing that Secretary Mayorkas vacate the parole program, said, quote, Secretary Mayorkas has turned the southern border into a meaningless line in the sand and little more than a speed bump for aliens flooding into the country. With that backdrop, Attorney General Bailey, I'd like to turn your attention specifically to the question of parole authority. On July 26, 2023, before the House Judiciary Committee, Secretary Mayorkas testified the Department of Homeland Security has used our parole authority consistent with the law and consistent with past practices of different administrations. He also claimed that his department is using the parole authority consistent with the law still. In your opinion, is Secretary Mayorkas' implementation of the parole statute lawful, and is his implementation of this policy affecting the security of the United States?
His policy implementation is unlawful in violation of the plain text of the statute, thereby forcing a lawsuit from several like-minded state attorneys general because of the drastic, terrible harm that's occurring on the streets in our communities.
Attorney General Drummond, you shared some of the devastating effects that failure to secure our border is having on your state. In your opinion, are these policies affecting the security and safety of your state and of our country?
The laws of the Immigration Nationality Act are clear and unequivocal, and they are not being upheld.
And Attorney General Knudsen, would you share your perspective on the harm to your state and our country that is being posed by failure to follow our laws?
1,700% increase in fentanyl deaths, confirmed state crime lab fentanyl deaths since 2019, Congresswoman. 11,000% increase in fentanyl seizures. Multiple 100% increase in human trafficking investigations since 2019. Those numbers speak for themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Garcia. You're up. Are you ready, or you want to go ahead with somebody else? Okay. Recognize Mr. Garcia for his 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just want to reiterate that, I think it's been said this very many times today by our colleagues here on the House side, on the Democratic side, that we all know that this impeachment inquiry, this effort to try to impeach the Secretary is a complete political stunt and sham, and I just want to reiterate that. We all know it's a political ploy that's not grounded in the facts, truth, and has been conjured up for just one simple purpose, and that's to score cheap political points against the Biden administration. We also know that we've had articles from the New York Times and other publications just really laying out that this is all about this pursuit of impeaching Mayorkas. It's about this kind of effort that's been started, quite frankly, by even a member of this committee for many, many, many months. That's all just really about hurting the president. Now, Professor Bowman, Republican leaders have been quoted promising donors that they would impeach Secretary Mayorkas in fundraisers back in April of 2023. Do you believe this committee has uncovered any evidence of high crimes or misdemeanors since that time?
Not that I'm aware of.
And thank you. And let's be clear, what we're moving ahead with today is because extremists, including some folks that are in this committee, have demanded it over and over again. Now, I want to give a couple quotes from some members of the House. Congressman Andy Biggs told Newsmax that Republicans, quote, have nothing to campaign on. And he said that he was embarrassed by this. Now, Congressman Chip Roy has said, and I want to quote, I want my Republican colleagues to give me one thing, one that I can go to campaign on to say that we did. Just one, end quote. And in fact, this last Monday, he went on TV to call the Republican conference, and I quote, a continued failure theater, end quote. So I understand that we're trying to throw red meat to an extremist base, but we're wasting the public's time, and we know that the Senate will laugh off all of these charges. And let's remember the bigger picture. Some of my friends on the other side of the aisle don't want to really govern. They're not serious about solutions that could actually become law. And they're obstructing $14 billion in emergency supplemental funding. They voted against hiring hundreds of additional Border Patrol agents and of ports of entry, and have opposed the incredible resources that we've been trying to send around technology, supporting organizations on the ground, support for Border Patrol agents, and many other types of funding. And I also want to remind the committee and the public that President Biden, on his first day in office, sent a comprehensive immigration plan to Congress, which Republicans have refused to act on. I also want to note that Secretary Mayorkas has continued to try to negotiate a bipartisan, sensible, and humane approach to actually fixing our immigration system and trying to actually address the issues that remain along the border. Because Democrats agree there are issues and challenges along the border, and we want to see those fixed. You know, as an immigrant myself, I've always believed this is a nation of immigrants. We should never forget that this country was based on so much hard work and labor of immigrants that now live all across this country. And our immigration system won't be fixed by this impeachment process, and it certainly won't be fixed by their proposal, which is H.R. 2. And let's set the record straight about H.R. 2. The bill would end Health and Human Services funding for legal representation of unaccompanied children in immigration proceedings. It would essentially send children to detention camps, and the bill subjects all unaccompanied children to an accelerated removal process, as we know, in horrible conditions at these facilities that we have seen over the last few years. And quite frankly, we know this is not just not a solution, but it's inhumane and cruel to demonize some of the most vulnerable people that are coming to our country. We want to address the root causes of migration. We want to ensure that legal pathways are followed. We want to make sure that folks receive the support they need back in their home countries. And we certainly don't want to defund organizations like Catholic Charities that would rip away aid to communities and to migrants across our country and along our border. The idea that our border problems, which have needed a bipartisan solution for decades, would be solved by H.R. 2 is just not true. It's an anti-immigrant policy, and we should reject it. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Luttrell for the gentleman from Texas for his 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for coming here today. Mr. Bowman, I appreciate and respect your opening statements, where it's probably the most educated I've been on where it comes to constitutional law and the process that we're in right now. So thank you for that education. My first question for you, sir, is can you give me the definition of a high crime and misdemeanor?
I think no single definition is satisfactory in every case, but I think Charles Black's is a pretty good general statement. That is to say, high crimes and misdemeanors should be extremely serious offenses in the way that serious crimes like treason and bribery are.
Extremely serious.
Second,
from that, let me go off of that one, sir. That's a great point. Is the selling of fentanyl inside the United States causing hundreds of thousands of deaths over the past years considered a high crime in your opinion?
I'm unaware that the secretary has sold any fentanyl.
No, I'm not directing that to the secretary. I'm asking you, is the selling of fentanyl inside the United States, killing hundreds of thousands of Americans over the years, would that be considered a high crime?
If you could establish
Boy, that's a yes answer all day long. If you don't say yes, that's bad
did
juju.
that, possibly.
All right, so let me ask you this
Aware of no evidence that ever happened.
There's no evidence that hundreds of thousands of people over the past few years have died from fentanyl overdoses?
I'm unaware of any evidence that Secretary Mayorkas has ever sold.
I'm not talking about Secretary Mayorkas. I'm talking about fentanyl deaths.
That's what we're here to talk about, are we not, Congressman? Secretary Mayorkas?
If you'll allow me to finish, if you'll answer my question, I'm getting to my point.
It's your time, so you can,
All right, so let me ask you this, since we're unhinged on the fentanyl deaths. Do you consider slavery a high crime?
Is there any evidence that Secretary Mayorkas has enslaved anyone?
This is getting a little bit more complicated than I thought it was going to be. I want to know if I'm supposed to go back to the folks in my district and tell them that the individual responsible for securing the American borders is falling short because the United States is one of the top countries on the planet for sex slaves. We lose 100,000 people a year to fentanyl overdoses, and the individual responsible for protecting us is Mr. Mayorkas. That's where I'm going with that. The fact that you didn't jump on top of and say that those things were absolutely involuntary, the worst things ever, is graphically disturbing to me. I pitched that one up as a softball, buddy, and you failed miserably. I'm from Texas. I feel this every day. And my colleagues and I, we have our disagreements, and I went down to the border with the other Republicans. I didn't have a polo on. I didn't get behind the podium. I talked to everybody down there that works down there. I talked to the ranchers, the citizens, and they tell me every single day that we are overwhelmed. And Ms. Titus brought up an amazing point. Yes, if we remove Mr. Mayorkas, Mr. Biden will put another Democratic member in that spot. We know that. I'm here for this reason. I'm sending a message that my people can no longer take it. We are dying by the droves. Every year I have to look at the mothers. I look at the mothers and fathers that lost their kids for fentanyl. I look at them every single day when I'm out in the district. And it's all coming across our southern border. Through the ports of entry. Yes, I got it. But if you're responsible for securing our borders, then you better act like it. And this individual is not. And that is the problem, sir. Period. In a discussion. These atrocities that we are seeing, you can't explain. 40 million people are enslaved on the planet. 40 million. And America is leading up top with that problem. And you ask where they come from, they come across our southern border and our northern border. And that, sir, is the responsibility of the secretary. And since he has failed to conduct his job for the past few years, we need somebody else. Now, I'm Mr. Mayorkas, I've chatted him up. He is a family man, he's a good man. And I'm gonna be crucified going back home and saying that. I've spoken face to face. And I bet he adamantly would disagree on the fact that yes, slavery is horrible. The fentanyl deaths are horrible. But there was a mother sitting in front of this committee months ago, last year, that sat there and looked at every single one of us. She lost her mother and her daughter to a coyote running through the town. Killed them both. She had to stand there in the emergency room while her daughter died. She looked us all in the face and said, you guys are absolutely doing nothing. You're doing nothing. So when we go to Mr. Mayorkas and say, hey, we need to act on this, and nothing's happening, sir, that is an absolute problem. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Clark from New York, the gentlelady from New York, for her 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon. Let me first start by thanking our witnesses for joining us this afternoon, today. You know, it's clear that MAGA Republican attempts to impeach Secretary Mayorkas have nothing to do with his performance and everything to do with the loyalty oath most of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have sworn to Donald Trump. After the House twice impeached Donald Trump, once for attempting to bribe an ally to investigate his political opponent and interfere in U.S. elections, and again for inciting an insurrection against the Capitol to steal an election, some of my Republican colleagues want to settle the score by impeaching someone, anyone, in the Biden administration. Secretary Mayorkas was sworn in on February 2nd of 2022. Less than 6 weeks later, Senator Lindsey Graham floated the secretary should resign during an appearance on Fox News. In May of 2021, Congressman Biggs appeared on the First and said that Secretary Mayorkas has got to go and introduced articles of impeachment of the secretary in August of that year. The secretary had not yet served 6 months. Other Republicans piled on that call in the months that followed. In April, Chairman Green fundraised off his planned impeachment efforts, telling his donors to, quote, get out the popcorn, unquote. But Secretary Mayorkas is hardly the only member of the Biden administration Republicans have disagreed with and then tried to impeach. Congressman Perry filed articles of impeachment against Attorney General Garland in October of 2021. Congresswoman Taylor Greene filed articles to impeach the Attorney General in August of 2022, FBI Director Christopher Wray in May of 2022, and filed multiple articles of impeachment against President Biden, sometimes more than one time in the same day. Congressman Norman filed articles of impeachment against Secretary Blinken in August of 2021, and Congressman Mills filed articles of impeachment against Secretary Austin in August of 2023. Meanwhile, Republicans have filed multiple resolutions to expunge the impeachments of Donald Trump. I'm concerned that my Republican colleagues fail to understand the gravity of impeachment. So, Professor Bowman, the founders engaged in robust debate when defining the criteria for impeachment. In your view, did the founders intend for impeachment to be a frequently used process to coerce the executive branch into policy decisions, or a rarely used tool reserved for extraordinary behavior that meets the definition of high crimes and misdemeanors?
Certainly the second, Congresswoman. I mean, the key point here is not only that impeaching Secretary Mayorkas will affect absolutely no change in border policy, border legislation, but even if impeaching a cabinet secretary could really accomplish something consequential, it would be terrible for the country because it would overthrow the basic principle of separation of powers on which the Constitution and our system of government are actually based. Congress and the executive are supposed to work together to solve the country's problems. They're often going to disagree about how to do that. But in our system, the solution is the hard work of legislation, of negotiation, of compromise, of coalition building. Impeachment is not and never has been the answer. And it is quite clear that the framers intended it not for that purpose whatsoever. They intended it for the most extraordinary circumstances and simply to resolve, a partisan political debate or to change policy is not it.
Thank you for your response. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Strong. And for the committee room, Mr. Strong will be the last, and then we'll go vote and come back at 2:15. So, Mr. Strong, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Attorney General Knudsen, I was glad to see you mention in your testimony that Secretary Mayorkas has regularly hidden behind the concept of prosecutorial discretion. I like how you said that, because that right there is one of the big issues. Today, specifically, we have talked about Secretary Mayorkas's abuse of prosecutorial discretion in the enforcement and removal of illegal aliens in the United States. I want to highlight again Secretary Mayorkas's 2021 memo, in which he stated the fact that an individual is a removable alien, therefore should not alone be the basis of an enforcement action against them. He went on to list factors that ICE agents should weigh when deciding whether to pursue enforcement and removal or not. Attorney General Knudsen, as a former prosecutor yourself, does it make any sense to give credence to mitigating factors when considering whether to prosecute someone that has already been proven to have broken the law when they crossed our border illegally?
Congressman, certainly not, especially when there's specific directive in federal law that requires that person be detained and be prosecuted. The idea that individual prosecutorial discretion suddenly means you have the right to blanket en masse pardon people or parole them into the heartland of the country, that simply does not exist in statute. I agree with the concept generally of prosecutorial discretion on a case-by-case basis, and indeed, that's what the federal law allows. But that's not what's being done here. It's being just implemented on a mass scale, wide open en masse, and that is simply not justified anywhere in federal code.
Thank you. I must say I was disappointed to see that the factors in favor of removal didn't include the significant financial and human costs to American citizens. Our hospitals are inundated with illegals. Schools are overrun with non-English speaking, setting other students back. And now New York has sent teachers and American students home and turning public schools into bunker houses for illegal aliens. This is totally unacceptable. Attorney General Bailey and Knudsen, you both specifically mentioned in your testimony that you do not view the crisis at the southern border as a resource issue. In other words, you both agree. You each explain to the committee why this is the case.
Certainly, that's what our lawsuit about his refusal to build the border wall is all about. He is flaunting the commands of this body. He is nullifying your constitutional authority over the power of the purse. And when that authority is no longer effective, impeachment is the last option. And I would point out that what we have here is not a policy disagreement. It's a willful violation to carry out an explicit directive of this body and an abdication of his official duties.
Mr. Chairman, Congressman, I would add that, the resources are being moved down there regularly. I mentioned I'm a northern border state. We have nearly 600 miles of border with Canada in my state. There's a large Customs and Border Control contingent in Montana. Most of those individuals have told me they've been cycled down to the southern border. The problem is not the number of agents down there. The problem is they are being instructed by Secretary Mayorkas to stand down and to not follow federal law. That's the issue here.
Thank you. On September the 6th, 2023, the DHS Office of Inspector General released its report titled DHS Does Not Have Assurance That All Migrants Can Be Located Once Released into the United States. That title alone should concern every single person in America. This investigation reviewed nearly 1 million migrant records and found that addresses for more than 177,000 migrants were either missing, invalid for delivery, or not legitimate residential locations. That's nearly 20% if you look at this, and that right there is totally unacceptable. We talk about leadership by the Secretary of Homeland Security. Well, you think about this. The first thing that I saw at the southern border on one of my many visits, is I noticed 20,288 border wall panels in storage. I came back to DC and found out that those 20,288 panels being stored in 3 different states, costing the American taxpayer more than $300 million. This is how they solve or try to work to solve the problem at the southern border. This is totally unacceptable, and this is another reason that we're here. Mr. Bowman, you're a constitutional law expert. Should President Trump have been impeached for a Russian hoax where the Steele dossier was created and paid for by the Clinton campaign? What do you think about that? Should that have happened? What were you teaching in your classroom?
Go ahead and answer the question, and then we'll, the
Mr.
gentleman's
Chairman,
time will be-
I'll yield to you, 'cause I know he doesn't want to answer that question.
No, do you not want the gentleman? Okay. All right. The gentleman yields. We will recess now until 2:15. We have 2 votes. I need to chat real quick with the witnesses just to make sure that you guys can stay. We're in recess. 2:15.